Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Throne of Heaven in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 66, Betrayal. For a moment, there was a stalemate between Ichigo's friends and Jin, as the silver-haired captain merely waited, grin on his face and sword in hand, for them to make the first move. Which they should take, but the first one to act was also the most likely to become the man's first target, and Ichigo hadn't forgotten how quickly he'd been neutralized the last time they'd fought. The best approach would have been for them all to attack at once, so that Jin might have to hesitate on who to target first, giving them an opening, but the trouble was to coordinate it in a way that wouldn't be open to disruption from their enemy. That was when he felt a light, almost soft pressure on his shoulders. It wasn't unlike what he'd felt from Kenpeki or Byakuya, but much less crushing. In fact, it was almost steadying in nature. He frowned at Jin, but then realized the Ryotsu wasn't coming from the man, who if anything looked to have a surprisingly small amount of Ryotsu when compared to any of the captains Ichigo had met, but rather from Ichigo's side, from Rukia. The realization left him puzzled for a moment, until he suddenly felt a sense of determination filling the Ryotsu, and realized Rukia was using it the same way her brother had. Except, unlike Byakuya, the intent was obviously not to intimidate them, but rather to reassure, and, he realized as the feeling of determination was replaced by one of readiness, also to communicate. Ichigo grinned as he felt the sense of readiness ramping up in sudden waves, almost like a rising countdown, and the moment the feeling switched to urgency, he, Rukia, Momo and Tatsuki charged at once, their coordination perfect. Rukia went with throwing the giant ice sphere in her hand, while Momo, at her left, swung her sword to send 5 fire globes at him, striking from Rukia's right. Ichigo swung Getsuga Tensho to send one of its cutting blasts of black Ryotsu at Jin, hoping the man would think it to still carry the power of Zero. He wasn't sure if Jin did or not, although the man did jump to let the attack pass under his feet, even as his sword stuck Rukia's globe, which should have left him open to Momo's barrage. Except the lengthened Zanpakuto didn't cut the ice sphere in half. Instead, when Jin swung to the side, it dragged the ice along, using it to smash into the fire projectiles, causing them to fall to the ground frozen, and only then did the sword finish to cut through it, letting the two halves fall to the side as Jin commented idly, "Being able to cut through anything I want also means I can decide not to cut through things, as well," as he landed from his jump with a smug smile, only for his foot to slip on what had suddenly turned from solidly packed earth into mud. Jin still managed to shorten his blade and put it in the way of Rukia's. The silver-haired man's Zanpakuto was already cutting through before ice exploded from the point of contact, sending Rukia rolling backward. She'd clearly known that'd be the result, as she managed to thrust her hand forward to send forth a Kido beam from it. Jin raised his own to form one of the small round shields Shinigami were so fond of, except that just as the beam was about to hit it, Rukia smiled smugly and twisted her hand, which somehow caused the beam to be absorbed by the shield, instead of stopped or exploded, and then unleashed it again, much larger, from the shield's other side, straight into Jin's face. As he closed in on Jin's form as he was pushed back, Ichigo saw the silver-haired captain had still managed to use Hakuta to tank the attack with only tiny bruises on his cheek, but the way he had been blasted back through the air would put him straight into Ichigo's path, so he thrust with Getsuga Tensho to send a piercing black beam at their enemy even as his other hand reached for Zanjutsu behind his back. Somehow, Jin managed to stop his own momentum by aiming his sword down and spearing the ground with it, then used it as a pole to turn himself around, before shrinking it to let himself swing its growing form into Ichigo's piercing beam, cutting it apart with a smug smile. That was when Momo's fire spheres smashed into him, the 5 explosion enveloping him completely, except that, when the smoke dispersed, Ichigo saw that Jin looked fully unharmed. He frowned. That didn't make sense. Momo's fireballs had both physical impact, actual flame, and compressed air pressure from the explosion itself damaging the things they hit, plus smoke marring them, so even if he'd used some sort of double coat to both stop the fire and limit the impact, some other sign that he'd actually been hit should have been there. It was even more obvious when, having taken advantage of Momo's explosion's cover, Tatsuki smashed into him from above with a hammer blow where she was using Hakuta to have set one of her fists on fire with anger and hardened the other with steel. That one hit left visible marks, in the form of scrapes and hints of singed cloth into his uniform, even if he'd clearly used hardened Hakuta to minimize the damage from it. The hit also sent Jin plummeting far faster than such a strike should have, but then the silver-haired man pointed his sword toward the ground and used such a powerful repulsive coat on it. All three of Ichigo himself, Rukia and Momo, who had been closing in on Jin's position, were pushed slightly backwards, and the captain himself almost floated in midair for a moment, despite the obvious fact that Chad had been increasing the gravity there. Meanwhile, Jin's other hand had grabbed Tatsuki, and threw her at Ichigo like a human projectile, with a strength Ichigo hadn't expected. Luckily, once again Tatsuki's movement through the air was far slower than it should have been, so Ichigo was able to lower his swords and catch her in his arms, so neither of the two was hurt, although it did send them falling back onto a surprisingly soft ground. Even with Chad helping them like that, Ichigo and Tatsuki both were left winded by the collision. He could feel his own wounds bleeding slightly from the effort, and it was obvious his friend had not fully healed wounds of her own she was suffering from. Meanwhile, Jin had landed and swung his sword, lengthened and charged with repulsion. Momo, the first on its path, had managed to dive to the ground and let the attack pass over her, but the fireballs she'd fired had been caught in the Zanpakuto's wake and were being thrown at Rukia as the blade continued its path toward her. The dark-haired girl made 3 perpendicular gestures with her free hand, creating an equal number of light pillars that deflected the fireballs, causing them to smash into each other, but didn't do much to stop Jin's sword. That one, Rukia avoided by using a set of quick consecutive taps in the air with Sode no Shirayuki, creating a suspended stairway for her to climb heavenward. Rukia seemed poised to use the height advantage to strike on Jin's position underneath her, so Ichigo readied himself as he could see Momo and Tatsuki were also doing, when suddenly, Rukia's eyes widened and she had to dodge to the side, and just a moment later a sphere of black smoke smacked into the platform she'd been standing on. The sphere stood suspended there for a moment before it started to spew more and more of itself, like a hail of black projectiles falling everywhere. Ichigo immediately enlarged Zanjutsu as much as he could and coated it with repulsion, which was enough to keep him, and Tatsuki next to him, safe. Momo's fireballs were apparently also able of homing on the dark projectiles and exploding them before they could hit her, although the comparison in the volumes of fire, which was slowly increasing as every newly spawned black projectile that hit the ground seemed to sprout more, didn't favor the girl, since the darkness seemed to be growing exponentially, while she could only fire off 5 at a time with each swing of her sword. Chad, however, had no such protections at all, so a sphere smacked straight into him, enveloping his body completely. A moment later, he was falling from the sky where the black sphere that had initially been aimed at Rukia stood. Tatsuki darted forward, with Ichigo moving his sword so he was able to cover her charge, and she managed to catch their falling friend, but with Chad himself unable to slow the fall by messing with the gravity, the impact was brutal, causing them both to collapse to the ground. Tuan. Taking your time, were you? I made it here as fast as reasonable. While Jin sounded friendly and perhaps a bit amused, the other voice was clearly annoyed. As Ichigo turned, he recognized the man as the same captain who had captured Renji back when Ichigo himself had first faced Jin. The man looked like he'd just been through heavy battle, with a visibly recent if somewhat healed wound across his chest and ruined clothes, which Ichigo could only hope that meant he would be at least as tired as Ichigo himself felt, and so hopefully not too useful of an ally for Jin to be reinforced by. As the man looked around, or rather, slowly rotated his head without focusing his eyes on anything, since he was clearly blind, his frown grew more pronounced, showing Tuan's growing displeasure at the situation. And it seems to me like you were dallying, considering how many enemies are still standing. Jin seemed completely unruffled by the comment, and answered, if I thought I'd be able to deal with them all on my own, why would I have signaled for you to come help? With a shrug of his shoulders. Tuan looked like he didn't believe Jin's justification, as he said, well, I'm now here, so let's get a move on. It won't be long before Yamamoto makes it here. We need to be finished and be gone before that comes to pass, in a very cold, accusatory tone. Jin? What is going on, and why would the captain commander showing up be bad? Everybody turned to the side, where Ichigo saw the blonde woman who had been trying to wake up the black-haired one in her arms having now turned her attention on Jin. This caused Tuan to frown in annoyance. Why is Matsumoto still alive? We were supposed to get rid of as much of the upper ranks of the Godai as possible, as well as remove any witness, and on my way here, I stabbed Seijin, ensured Urahara and Mayuri would be killed by their own traps, and intercepted Kensei and Shihei as they had detached themselves from the melee that's going down there between Aburai, Odoribashi, and their teams, striking them down. Did you do anything at all to push forward our goals? Jin scratched the back of his head at that, answering, well, I ensured the Sokioka was activated. After that, I was kind of busy fighting Yodomaru, you know. With an embarrassed smile on his lips. Then the smile turned sinister as he added, in a dangerous tone. But I can correct that mistake now. And then, before anybody had time to react, his sword, which he'd aimed at Matsumoto while he was scratching his head, suddenly grew in length, striking the blonde woman in her belly. Her eyes widened in shocked surprise and disbelief, and Jin said, I'm sorry, Ranjaku, but this is the only way. Before the sword shrunk, Matsumoto's eyes closing as she collapsed to the ground, blood pooling under her. Tuan scoffed, and he seemed about to comment, but then he suddenly dodged to one side, as did Jin, while a literal waterfall of glowing golden light fell down from the sky, and Rukia shouted. I'm going to make you regret all of the evils you've committed, murderers. Jin chuckled as he exited from his roll into an upwards moving strike, but Ichigo swung Zanjutsu in response, growing the blade as big as he could as he sharpened it to cut through Jin's. While he hadn't expected it, he wasn't really surprised when the result, despite it being his sword's edge and the back of Jin's own blade that had met, was that Zanjutsu was the sword to be cut into, rather than the opposite. Even as he charged the blade's coat with as much repulsion as he could muster, which toward Jin was quite a lot, he also swung Getsuga, as he'd hoped. The dual attacks forced the captain to dodge and interrupt his attack on Rukia anyway, even if the first attempt hadn't. Momo had raised a golden shield over her head with Kido and used the temporary reprieve from fending off darkness projectiles to send a barrage of fireballs straight at Tuan, who intercept them with more of his own, while taking merely a disdainful, short-ranged step to the left with Shunpo to let pass at his side the huge golden sphere Rukia had shot from wherever she was above the light waterfall. The glow was so strong she was impossible for Ichigo to see. Or at least, he thought that was the reason, until the golden sphere suddenly exploded, Rukia apparently having somehow hidden herself inside of it. Even if he wasn't looking, Tuan immediately went to dodge, but there was no mistaking the expression of shocked surprise on his face, and while Rukia failed to impale him with her thrust, so no Shirayuki did manage to lightly scratch his sword arm, which was enough to entirely encase it in ice before Tuan had moved far enough away from the white Zanpakuto for the effect to stop. He went to break the ice away with his other hand, only to pause with a grunt of pain the moment the hardened Ryutsu around his fingers touched the ice, as Rukia said, a dark look in her eyes that didn't really match her smug expression. Careful there, I froze through your blood and down to the bone. If you break it too quickly, you risk tearing your arm apart while you do. And that'd be a shame, wouldn't it? Jin chuckled at Rukia's comment, apparently amused at his ally's predicament, and commented in a light tone. Seems like there's a good deal of fighting left to be done after all, isn't there? I think you will find the fight is actually over now. The new voice was familiar, and as Ichigo tracked it to its source, he was surprised to see a man with messy brown hairs and a friendly smile on his face, square glasses over soft brown eyes, emerging from behind one of the two pillars at the center of the hilltop. He was left speechless by the shock and surprise, as was Rukia. Momo's surprise instead manifested in her reaching out toward the white sleeve of his Haori with a trembling hand, eyes wide, as she was the one closest to the man. When her fingers closed around fabric, she whispered, "You're real," and then lunged forward, hugging the man as she murmured, "Captain, you're here," clearly overwhelmed by emotion, tears flowing freely from her eyes. Aizen gently patted the bob atop her head, his friendly smile turning somewhat amused, while Momo seemed incapable of doing much else than cling to her captain with all of her strength. Rukia was quicker to collect herself and asked, a note of disbelief in her voice. "Captain, how? What happened? I thought you had been murdered." He nodded amiably at that, looking up at her as he answered, tone mild. "I had a negation buried here so I could reach the place quickly, that's how I'm here. As for the matter of me having been murdered, to have everybody believe that had happened was the plan, yes." That caused Momo to look up at him, a confused what? Escaping her lips, Aizen lowered his gaze to glance at her, patting her head again as he said, "Goodbye, Momo," and then Ichigo saw a sword erupting through the short girl's back. Everybody seemed paralyzed at the sight, except for Aizen himself, who slowly slid his sword out of Momo's chest, absent-mindedly looking at the blood coating the blade, before he used his other hand, which was still gripping her hairs, to throw her in the space between the two pillars that Rukia had been chained to before. Momo let out a low sound of pain as she landed, and that sign that the stabbing had not killed her, yet, was enough to break Rukia out of her shock as she shouted, disbelief, and slowly growing fury in her voice. Captain Aizen, what is the meaning of this? What have you done? Why? Completely unhurried, Aizen reached with one hand for the black pillar closest to him, absent-mindedly tapping some of the glowing symbols on it, even as he looked back up at Rukia with the same disarming expression. I'm triggering the Sokyoku, of course, while having a victim isn't necessary to make sure the sabotage of the barrier can't be easily reversed, it will widen the window of opportunity we're going to get out of this. What are you talking about? What's going on? Before Aizen could answer the question, Jin interjected, sounding curiously amused and in no way surprised by what was going on. Isn't Yamamoto supposed to be the only one who can activate the device, even if anybody can power it up? Aizen's tone as he answered was very relaxed, much like his expression, although there was also a certain self-satisfaction on his features. Not any longer, every secret Yamamoto has ever known, now I know of it as well. As he said the last word, his finger tapped a symbol that suddenly caused all of the glyphs on the pillars to change the color they were glowing in from golden to an angry red, a clear sign the device was about to go off. Then Momo's body suddenly moved, but not of its own volition, rather, it seemed as if the ground depressed itself for a moment, and then bounced back to its normal state, pushing the girl away in the process. She had just cleared the area when a flash of red light erupted between the pillars, and Ichigo felt the same sense of dread as when a Zanpakuto was about to strike, except magnified 1,000,000 times, coming from the area, and felt a certainty that, if Momo, or Rukia, or anybody else for that matter, had been there when it activated, they would never have survived it. Aizen's expression changed slightly, from relaxed to perplexed, as he saw that Momo had been saved in such a fashion, then turned toward the point where Chad was kneeling on the ground, with Tatsuki supporting him. He let out a sigh, before saying in a still pleasant tone, but one carrying just a hint of boredom. Jin, please cut down one of those pillars before they finish discharging the energy. Tuan, take care of the ants, if you would. Ichigo's eyes widened at that, and he immediately launched himself towards his friends. He saw the black sphere shooting ahead of himself, and realizing he wouldn't be able to outspeed it, instead he used the coat on Zanjutsu to release repulsion in opposing directions, causing himself to spin forward as he charged his awakened sword. Then, the moment Tuan stepped out of the darkness in front of Chad and Tatsuki, reaching out with his hand to strike at them, Ichigo swung, releasing the power of Getsuga Tensho, the spinning movement accelerating it and giving it more penetration, and the attack hit the inside of Tuan's elbow like an high-powered drill, punching through it with enough power to leave the arm limp and useless, with a deep hole where the elbow would have been, bleeding profusely. Tuan turned a furious glare toward Ichigo, but with one arm encased in ice and the other incapacitated in such a fashion, all the Shinigami could do was jump backwards and away as Ichigo landed in a protective crouch in front of Chad and Tatsuki. That was when Jin's blade impacted one of the two black pillars, cutting the top out of it, which caused an explosion of red light so powerful, the whole sky looked like it had changed color for a moment, and Ichigo was left blinded by it for a few heartbeats, and even afterwards, he had after images swimming in his eyes, making it hard to distinguish what was going on. He did saw, however, that Rukia had moved, and was now in front of Aizen, screaming in fury as she swung at him. Before Sode no Shirayuki could reach him, the man simply moved backwards and out of the way, as if was anticipating Rukia's attacks before she had even initiated them, and eventually stepped into one of Tuan's spheres of darkness, and when Rukia cut through it, he wasn't inside of it anymore. And then Ichigo suddenly felt the presence of a huge amount of Ryutsu behind himself, alongside a feeling of pressure second only to what Kenpaku's power had inflicted on him before pushing down on his shoulders. In the split second before he could react to the sudden change in pressure, or Zanjutsu could absorb it, steel was biting through his back, and then the pressure disappeared even as he lost all sensitivity under his chest, and collapsed to the ground, his legs no longer responsive. He tried to move his arm to swing backwards, but the mere attempt caused him more pain than he'd ever felt before, leaving him lightheaded and panting on the ground in short breaths, even as above and behind him Aizen's voice said, in a lazy lecturing tone. I would be careful of moving too much, I did just sever your spine, your nervous system might take some time to recover from that, if it ever does. Ichigo tried to access Shiro's power at that, to show the bastard what he could recover from, but the Hollow was still too tired from the fight with Byakuya for him to help. He weighed whether he should try and force the matter by accessing the Hujioku, but before he could, Aizen spoke up again, at the same time as a wave of unpleasant Ryotsu invested him in a manner that made Ichigo feel as if his whole soul was being scrutinized in its entirety. "Now," Tuan said after checking the big guy, "that it was either you or this girl here, and it seems he was correct, and you're the one who is holding my prize, Kurosaki. I shouldn't be surprised, really." And then, he felt a spike of pain in his chest, like something had just been ripped out of him. It took Ichigo a moment to realize that Aizen had reached into the soul pocket Rukia had created for him, and as the man moved from behind Ichigo to standing next to him, he could see Aizen was now holding a sphere of swirling, oily black smoke in the grasp of bloody fingers, regarding it with a cold satisfaction that was at odds with the man's usual friendly and open expression. Despite that, as his features settled into it, Ichigo couldn't help but feel that this new look suited him far more, as if the muscles on his face felt more at ease in this. Rukia's expression of fury, on the other hand, didn't fit her features at all, but that didn't stop her any as she shouted, slowly advancing toward Aizen. You were working with Jin, the entire time. Was the Hujioku all you wanted? Is that what all this is about?" Aizen chuckled, pocketing the sphere before shaking his head gently and then answering. "No, my dear. It was the other way around. Jin is the one who was working for me the whole time." As if to confirm those words, the silver-haired man stepped into Rukia's path, forcing her to interrupt her advance as he waved genially, while Aizen continued, in a seraphic tone. "And the Hagyoku was never the goal, it is merely a tool, that I shall use to finally achieve true change in Soul Society." That seemed to drain some of the rage from Rukia, replacing it with confusion instead. Seeing this, Aizen sighed and went on. "Honestly, Rukia, I am still the same person I was before. I've just decided that time has come to take matter into my own hands, and force the change I have wanted for so long. This can't be who you really are. Can't it?" He looked amused, and reached for his glasses, removing them from his face, then glanced at them with a wondering expression as he said, idly. "Sometimes I wonder what it is that makes people so easily fool themselves into believing things are peaceful, just because they appear to be so at a glance. Yet, it seems to be innate to humans, to believe and trust in that which they are shown, if it is sufficiently reassuring, somehow, despite the fact I have a power that sharpens my senses and enlightens my mind beyond what anybody else can even conceive of, and Mayuri is my lieutenant. Everybody just accepted I would need corrective lenses to fix my sight and let me see past my nose. Such a common weakness, and yet enough to make me appear relatable and harmless, even as I've been a captain longer than any but four, and while I'm smarter than them all." Aizen's hand opened, letting the glasses fall to the ground, and then he passed it over his hairs, somehow straightening them and leaving them slicked backwards with a touch, something Ichigo was sure his own hairs never would agree with, whereas for Aizen, only a single lock had remained untamed. Rukia looked at him as if she'd never seen him before, shaking her head, to which Aizen's gaze hardened, and his voice was filled with disappointment. "I'm well aware you will refuse to understand that, or perhaps just cannot. I tried, to see if you and Momo would have been amenable to work with me, I asked, and I even had Jin double-check the matter for me. And you were firm in your refusal to help me, in your unwillingness to do what would be necessary." That seemed enough to draw some more emotion from Rukia, as she shouted back. "You tried to have me killed." He waved his hand in the air, as if to say that was a matter of little importance. "I needed the Sokyoku to be activated, but Jin was there the whole time. I even told him to let you know that all you needed to do, in order to be rescued, was to join us, but you kept refusing. I can't save those who refuse to save themselves." Rukia was trembling and there were tears in her eyes, and Ichigo couldn't guess if the reaction was motivated from anger or sadness. In truth, he doubted Rukia, herself, would have been able to tell. Still, she seemed to muster her determination, glaring at him as she said, "How can you think this makes any sense at all? Do you truly believe you can win?" "I would like to hear the answer to that as well, Sosuke." The new voice was female and matronly, and Ichigo could feel the new Ryotsu slowly seeping into his surroundings. It was similar, in a way, to how Rukia, Kenpeki and most of all Byakuya had used the pressure their Ryotsu exerted as a weapon, and yet to say it was the same would be an insult. The touch was very light, barely noticeable, like a soft breeze grazing his skin. The riots are rarefied in volume and minimal in quantity, like a soft feather compared to a giant bludgeon. Yet, it seemed to slide itself everywhere, the soft touch somehow reaching deeper than any of the other times he'd experienced ever had, making it all the way to inside his very bones, but it didn't feel invasive, instead dispensing a calming, soothing presence that took away the pain Ichigo was still feeling from his current wound, in a manner he wouldn't have thought possible. Aizen, Rukia, Jin, and Tuan all had turned into the direction the voice was coming from, and with his pain reduced as it was, Ichigo managed to turn his head, although doing so caused all the sensitivity on his left arm to disappear from his awareness. This allowed him to see the woman that was approaching, and he noticed she was coming from the side of the hill that laid next to the big park where Yoriuki was supposed to fight the 2nd Division's captain. But this woman was nothing like either of those two. She looked somewhere between her 30 and 40, with big blue eyes and long black hairs that were collected in a braid that was settled over her chest and reached past her waist. She was also wearing the white haori of a captain, but Ichigo noticed that she had no sword secured to the black and white obishi sitting over her Shinigami uniform. Yet, despite this, and despite the calm, there was something about the woman's countenance that belied the peaceful image she transmitted. It took a moment for Ichigo to understand, but then he did. While every Shinigami looked solid in a way most spiritual things didn't, due to the sheer density of their Ryutsu, this woman had a crispness to her, as if it wasn't that she was more solid than the world, but rather, the world was made more fragile by her presence in it. It was subtle, and Ichigo quickly pushed the realization to the back of his mind as Aizen began speaking, but now that he knew, it was impossible to ignore. Captain Anohana. I must admit myself surprised at your presence here. I supposed you would be in the 4th Division's headquarters, working on the mystery of my death. While the expression on Aizen's face had remained outwardly the same, Ichigo detected a slight hint of surprise in his tone. The woman, Anohana, apparently, opened her arms in a disarming manner and answered, in a slightly amused tone. Is that your way of admitting I was able to fool your Bankai, Sosuke? Or just an hint of your limitations? That caused Aizen's face to go very still, the amiable expression disappearing, while Rukia said, with a frown. What has Captain Aizen's Bankai to do with anything? Anohana glanced at Rukia, her expression neutral as she motioned toward Aizen. Because Sosuke lied to us about how it works. She returned her attention to him, and went on, with a serious expression now. He told us that his Bankai let him create copies of people by replicating the way those people's perception manifested when he had used his Shikai to personally experience them. But that is not the truth at all. That would not have allowed him to make my autopsy of his corpse as complicated and difficult for me to parse as it was. No, what his Bankai does is manipulate the perceptions of those people his Shikai has let him understand, so he can control everything they sense and feel. A world of perfect illusion. Isn't that right, Sosuke? Aizen didn't answer, but Rukia did, with a frown on her face. But, if that's right, how is it he's not stopping us from hearing you reveal that? Anohana's eyes glinted with slight approval at the comment, even though her expression didn't change, as she continued her explanation. Because he can't. After all, he was able to keep his Bankai active for almost 3 days straight to fool me, probably only sleeping when I did, otherwise, I'd have discovered his ruse immediately. That implies there is no range limit to the ability, nor that it needs to affect a limited area, and that it isn't constrained by things such as line of sight. But no Bankai's power is limitless. They all have a power meant for the disruption of large number of enemies at once, but they're also a composite of the souls that give birth to them, and there is no such thing as a soul with infinite power. Aizen chuckled, shaking his head slightly, even as a wry smile formed on his lips. Well, I suppose I shouldn't have expected anything less from the greatest Zanjutsu expert in Soul Society. Then, his expression grew more arrogant. But you don't know what the exact limits are, or you would have taken advantage of them already, isn't that right, Captain Anohana? Her expression turned very disappointed at that, and Anohana replied. I know that you do not think Kyoka Suijutsu would be enough to allow you to control the perceptions of all of Soul Society at once, little Sosuke, otherwise this whole complicated plot you came up with would have been wholly unnecessary. And just like Miss Kukaki said before, even with such a power at your fingertips, I fail to see how you could think you will be able to win against the full strength of Soul Society. Aizen's smile grew even more arrogant and prideful. That's because you don't know what my win condition actually is. And I imagine you are going to tell us, then. Aizen shrugged, apparently unfazed by the completely unimpressed expression on the woman's face, and answered, why not? Yamamoto already figured it out anyway. When I had the information about the key stolen from his mind, I might as well tell you. He raised his head high, a growing confidence to his posture, and then said proudly, I'm going to rewrite the very fabric of the world we exist into as you know it, and reshape it in a manner that better conforms to my vision of what it should be. The unbearable vacancy on the throne of heaven will at long last come to an end, as I am going to fill it. Anohana looked genuinely shocked at that, and whispered back, in a low tone. You cannot honestly think that is going to work. Ichigo was left dumbfounded, but he did have at least enough control of his body to ask a question of his own, even if it caused him to cough blood halfway through. What is the throne of heaven? Rukia had a troubled expression on her face as she answered. An ancient artifact that predates Soul Society. It powers the barrier around the Suriati and a number of other things, and it's the reason the city can exist as a safe haven from hollows, why it was built here rather than anywhere else. Aizen smiled arrogantly at Rukia and said, in a condescending tone. Oh, my dear Rukia, it's so much more than that. Rukia glared at him at that, and shot back. Is this about the legend of the Soul King? How they say that, when the throne was first found, a Shinigami sat in it and used its power to create the city from nothing, but just using the power once was enough. He was destroyed by it entirely, which is why the throne is empty. Aizen shook his head, apparently finding Rukia's explanation lacking. I will leave it to Yamamoto to enlighten you. If he wants to, he will not, and that will make my victory all the easier to achieve. Jin chimed in at that, in an intrigued tone. Is that really the full reason, Lord Aizen? Aizen smiled at that, in that arrogant manner of his, and answered. Not entirely, Jin, you're right about that. I admit, the idea of the kids here constantly bothering the old bastard about the matter while he rebukes them all without explaining why is endlessly amusing to me. That makes it sound like you think you're going to leave, Sosuke. Are you under the impression I will let you do so? Aizen's attention returned to Anohana, who had her arms crossed in front of herself, tapping one of her arms with her fingers. He maintained his self-satisfied expression as he answered her, apparently unbothered by her threat. Are you sure you want to break your pacifism vow and attack us now, Captain Anohana? I admit that, if you had your Zanpakuto with you, your Bankai would be enough to indiscriminately kill everybody on the hill, but without that, how could you be sure I wasn't going to fake my death again? Anohana looked genuinely puzzled at that. I have no need to do that. You made it clear you don't think your Bankai can tackle the Captain Commanders, so all we need to do is wait for his return, which in turn means I only need to keep you here, a remarkably easier task than making sure you are destroyed. Unless you think that, because I don't have Minajiki along right now, the three of you might be able to escape by attacking together and defeating me. That caused Tuan to look like he'd just swallowed a whole lemon, and even Jin's smile dimmed somewhat, while Aizen looked hesitant for the first time since he'd shown up. However, he collected himself quickly, as he shook his head. No, I don't think that would be a good idea. Anohana's expression turned to a slight curiosity. What are you going to do, then? Trying to out-trick me in a Kido duel, perhaps. Rukia scoffed loudly at that, as if the mere idea was ridiculous, but Aizen smiled instead, answering. No, I don't think that would work either. But, you seem to have forgotten which division I was the captain of for the last dozen of centuries, Captain Anohana. And then, before he could react, he reached for something in his uniform, with Jin and Tuan mimicking the movement, which caused a square pillar of light to surround each of the three of them. Anohana seemed surprised by that, frowning slightly as she said. That's not a Kido. What are you doing, Sosuke? He smiled and answered. Using one of my most brilliant inventions, of course, it's called negation, and I'm sure Rukia will be able to fill you in about the details later. Bye for now, but I want you to know, I will be coming back, and not alone. He pulled out the Hujioku out of his pocket, and raised it in front of his face, the blackness inside the sphere spiraling in a more agitated manner than Ichigo had ever seen it do. Then, suddenly, as Aizen's smile grew more satisfied, the darkness went absolutely still, which Ichigo had never seen it do in all of his training with the device. The threat was bare in Aizen's voice as he explained. I have been assembling an army of hollows for some time now. With this, I can now increase their powers 100-fold, such as you have never seen before. The greatest army of hollows which ever attacked Soul Society, strong enough to almost wipe away your precious Godai and kill 2/3 of your captains, was led by just 4 Vastolord. I wonder how you'll fare, if I were to bring one led by as many of those as you have divisions. And with those words, Aizen disappeared, leaving the rest of them behind on the devastated hilltop. Anohana frowned, commenting to herself that's not good, but then shook her head and turned to the rest of them, saying in a much more calm tone. But it's also not a problem we need to deal with right now. Instead, making sure none of you here dies is what's important. I suspect we will need as many fighters as possible to deal with the dangers ahead. Then she waved one hand in Ichigo's direction, snapping her fingers, and he found golden light wrapping around his limbs and head, before the sense of calm he was wrapped into suddenly multiplied in intensity, and he slipped into unconsciousness. Chapter 67, Yamamoto. As he stood in front of the full-wall window at the back of his office, atop the tallest tower in the royal palace at the center of the Suryutai, which gave him a full view of the entirety of Soul Society, Genri Yusai Shijikuni Yamato, Captain Commander of the Godai 13, reflected on the current situation, and how it might have come about. It was not, in truth, the first time that some Shinigami had tried to oppose the way Soul Society worked. In fact, it happened at least once a century, and it had become more common in the latest 300 years or so. Personally, Yamamoto thought that the problem was with entitlement of the newest souls, those who hadn't been under the constant threat of hollows every moment of their whole existence, and thus weren't sufficiently grateful for the protection Soul Society provided. When Yamamoto had first come to be, his soul was born into a tribe in the spiritual world that had to be constantly on the move, running away from hollows every day, until they'd developed Hakuta to fight them off, and even with that ability to fight back, every day still required constant struggle to stay alive. It was only when the original 46 tribes who were now the great noble families had come together and formed an organized resistance that Plus had no longer needed to worry about being eaten every hour of every day. Things that the newer souls that came to Soul Society took for granted, as they constantly demanded changes to the very systems that allowed them to make such demands in the first place, with not a drop of gratitude for the people who ensured that those systems, which kept them safe rather than spending their existence in constant terror, stayed in place. However, none of those oppositions had come anywhere close to being as big of a threat as Aizen's recent actions had been. For one big thing, no rebels before had actually succeeded in weakening the power structure of Soul Society itself, whereas Aizen had actually killed the entirety of the Central 46, a group which included 4 retired captains in its numbers. Even if he'd only been able to do that by using his Bankai to fake his death, the assistance of Tuan, Ichimaru, and Tsukishima, taking advantage of the law to order the council chamber sealed so he could keep others away, and the negation devices that he'd kept secret, it was still a very worrisome thing. Of course, Aizen, unlike most of the rebels Yamamoto had to dispose of in the last 3 centuries or even his allies Ichimaru and Tuan, was actually part of the nobility, if only a minor house. It was only logical that he would be more successful at subverting the systems upon which Soul Society ran than the haphazard efforts of people who didn't understand a thing about those systems even as they tried to fight them. Which made sense if his goal was, as Yamamoto suspected, merely to abuse the real abilities of the throne for himself, rather than any of the high-minded idealism he, and the many rebels before him, claimed to be motivated by. After all, Aizen had had many chances to join in any of the numerous smaller challenges to the Central 46's authority in the millennia he'd been a captain, but he never had, which in Yamamoto's eyes was proof enough he didn't truly care about ideals. It had still created a very difficult situation to navigate, however. Even knowing Aizen had to have relied on Tsukishima's power to accomplish it, the way the man had exploited the details of the First Division's operative procedures was worrisome. Aizen had ensured that, with the exception of Kojiro and Yamamoto himself, the best Shinigami division was confined to specific areas of the palace and unable to interfere with his plan, while at the same time giving himself 4 days of uninterrupted access to the door to the throne room. which clearly meant the procedures should be reviewed, to ensure they weren't so easily subverted in the future. At least, Yamamoto reassured himself, Aizen's plan had failed. The man had ordered Rukia's execution while pretending it was an order from the Central 46, all to disable the Sokioku protection, betting on his ability to be able to overcome all the other defenses by having Tsukishima steal the manner to beat them directly from Yamamoto's own memory. Probably, Aizen was counting on what he'd gleaned from the 3 times he'd been allowed to study the throne under Yamamoto's personal supervision, which just went to prove how wise of his had been to keep the ultimate security measure secret. Of course, Aizen now knew, but that would not make it in any way easier for him to acquire the key, which meant that, ignoring the unavoidable military cost that would be required to repel the invasion Aizen had threatened, the big problem was the political situation. With the entirety of the Central 46 dead, until replacement were named, Seoul society was under martial law, and that was unacceptable. Which was why he smiled when he felt the powerful presence approaching his rooms, and turned just in time to greet the newly arrived man with a respectful nod that was quickly returned. "Captain Kukaki, I thank you for responding promptly to my summon." Byakuya's expression didn't change much, and he just let the smallest hint of acknowledgement into his ryotsu. Yamamoto was well versed enough in the traditional ways to know that this was very much the correct greeting between two people of their respective standing, so he had no reason to criticize it. Yet, he couldn't help but be a bit annoyed by it, since such formality, while officially required, was commonly not utilized in military situations. It felt needlessly pedantic. But he couldn't really refuse to accept the gesture without coming across as dismissive of Seoul society's traditions, so he carefully avoided letting out a long breath, merely returning the greeting in kind, letting out just enough ryotsu to be slightly more than Byakuya and showing the same amount of emotion. That seemed enough to prompt the man to speak, in his usual firm and controlled tone, with the barest hint of polite curiosity spiking in his ryotsu. "I was not made aware of the reason for this summon." He then waited, and Yamamoto knew enough of the man's patience to be assured he would do so for however long it took to get an answer. Yamamoto decided to study the captain instead. Despite it having been only 2 days from the Battle of Sokioku Hill, Byakuya was as composed as ever, his hair ornament in place, his Shinigami uniform and Haori immaculate, his posture straight and relaxed. It almost seemed like he was in perfect health, which was incongruous when he had, reportedly, barely survived a point-blank grazing hit from Asiro. In fact, Yamamoto would almost think it suspicious, as if the man had just pretended to lose his fight, rather than actually being defeated, in order to save his sister, if not for the fact the man had not, at any point, even asked for her to be spared. In the end, with things as they were, it wasn't particularly important, so Yamamoto pushed the thought away, to instead focus on the matter at hand. "I have been informed that the Kukaki family has not yet selected the new representative for the Central 46, it was my hope you could give me confirmation as to the reason." Byakuya raised his eyebrow very slightly at that, a general mix of surprise and disbelief lightly coloring his ryotsu as he answered. "As I am sure you know, Captain Commander, after losing a member of the family, the traditional rites require a period of mourning of no less than 2 months, during which any activity other than what is necessary for the survival of the family, such as service in the Godai 13, is to be delayed. As such, we cannot currently provide you with a representative." Yamamoto let a little bit of his annoyance into his ryotsu, holding back the much greater amount of it he was feeling. It almost seemed like Byakuya was being deliberately obstructive, which he didn't at all approve of. "I'm well aware. However, if I were to be made aware of the most prominent candidates, I could consult with them to ensure that any decisions I made during this transitional period don't go against the desires of our government body." The surprise and disbelief immediately left Byakuya's ryotsu, so quickly Yamamoto would suspect them to have been entirely manufactured, if the man's constant practice of his control wasn't so well known. It was then replaced with a light feeling of comprehension. "That's very considerate of you, Captain Commander, and the Kukaki family deeply appreciates the consideration to our institution that your choice presents. However, we currently do not have a selected candidate to offer you, so that's unfeasible." A hint of apologetic sternness then took over Byakuya's ryotsu as he continued, "Furthermore, I am afraid that, even after the 2 months of mourning are over and a decision can be made, the family might require a delay due to a military emergency." Yamamoto frowned. He got a sense of where this was going now, and he didn't like it at all. He let his annoyance slowly drift into irritation, as he asked directly. Do you mean to say that you are the primary candidate, and thus the family is unwilling to vote you in the position until Aizen's invasion has been repelled? While that made some sense, it seemed very unlikely to Yamamoto. The Kukaki family was the only one of the Great 46 to have ever had more than one captain active at the same time, and every single captain in the story of the 6th Division had come from their family. It was extremely unlikely that they would lose the practical benefits that having a captain in the family had granted them for millennia by voting Byakuya to the role or representative in the present situation, even if the man himself were willing to lose the influence over his own family affairs and internal politics that renouncing his title as family head, a requirement to be the central 46 representative for the family, would inflict on him. Which Yamamoto highly doubted. Byakuya didn't smile, nor project any amusement or mockery in his Ryotsu. Instead, his feelings went to a more neutral feeling of genuine sadness as he said, discussing such matters would violate the family's confidentiality, which I cannot do. Despite this, Yamamoto felt himself pretty secure in thinking that Byakuya, or at least the Kukaki themselves, were angling for some form of political advantage in this situation. It was a well-known fact that the Kukaki family had been the one who had mobilized all the others and initiated the process of unification that had led to the creation of Soul Society. Yamamoto could still remember Rie Kukaki locating his tribe and bartering for their support, including by personally appealing to him to lead the armed forces of the new alliance despite she, herself, being a deadly fighter and already having over 20 other tribes at her back willing to follow her, simply to increase the number of souls that would be kept safe by the alliance. Many of the families descended from those tribes still looked to the Kukaki for leadership, and although the power block wasn't as strong as it'd been when Soul Society had first been founded, it was still over 1/3 of the total votes among the 46 great noble families. Which was why Yamamoto had wanted to speak with Byakuya, as all of those families had yet to give him the name of the candidates and he was sure that, if the Kukaki did, they would then follow along. However, it was now apparent to him that he'd had the situation backwards. Those 16 families were withholding their answer intentionally, because of the Kukaki's meddling. Letting some hints of disappointment color the already present irritation within his Ryotsu, Yamamoto asked, in a pointed tone. And what if, in my role as Captain Commander, I were to dismiss you from your role as Captain? Would that remove the problem of the military emergency that is holding back your vote? Byakuya's Ryotsu was flooded with open disbelief, but with a particular tinge Yamamoto recognized as the disbelief not being in the possibility of the threat being carried out, but rather, in the fact it had been uttered. In a sense, it was astonishing the gall of the Kukaki boy in doing that, as he was practically implying that, if Yamamoto were to follow up with the threat, he would be an idiot. However, the disbelief was quickly replaced with a sense of understanding that was almost patronizing in nature, as if Byakuya were assuming the threat to be a result of lack of knowledge, rather than stupidity, thus making it impossible for Yamamoto to call him out on the insult unless he wanted to admit he might think himself an idiot. Especially when Byakuya said, in a very reasonable tone. Such an action would, in fact, only increase the urgency of the military emergency in the eyes of the Kukaki family. Furthermore, in my role as captain of the 6th Division rather than head of the Kukaki, I would be remiss in my duty if I didn't mention that, despite having acquired Bankai, Lieutenant Abarai is not yet qualified for a promotion. Removing me from my position would greatly reduce the power of the Godi 13. Yamamoto already knew that, obviously. Abarai had provided a solid showing for himself in the attack to the Sokyoku in terms of combat ability, but he'd still lost once Captain Odoribashi had released his Bankai, making it the 4th time he'd lost a fight against a captain, after Tuan, Zaraki, and Byakuya himself, across the span of just as many days. And of course, Yamamoto wasn't unaware that he had 2 empty spots in his captain lineup, nor that Tuan had killed his own lieutenant, Kensei Maguruma, leaving the 9th Division leaderless. The act had clearly been intentional. The division's first seat, Shihei Hisagi, had only survived the same attack from Tuan because of an esoteric side effect of his Shikai the boy himself hadn't previously recognized, and indicated that Tuan at least, if not Aizen himself, wanted to leave as many divisions without a clear chain of command as possible. Removing Byakuya from his post would indeed weaken the Godi 13 further, possibly meaning far more casualties once Aizen made his move, and both of them knew it. Which didn't mean Yamamoto was willing to simply let the boy dictate to him, especially when he was being so deliberately obstructionist, willingly delaying the restoration of proper political proceedings to Seoul society. You realize that, until the Central 46 can be assembled and martial law remains in effect, I could use it to severely penalize the Kukaki family for delaying the restoration to proper functionality our institution. Is that your desire? He let some anger filter into his ryotsu, to which Byakuya reacted by letting unyielding determination into his, a clear show of his unwillingness to budge as he declared, expression serious. No more than it would be yours, Captain Commanders, considering how concerned you have stated yourself to be over returning power to the proper authorities rather than keeping it for yourself. As for my desire, given that you have declared yourself willing to force a captain-level fighter into retirement, having Ichibe Hyasub undergo such a forced retirement would greatly help the Kukaki family hasten the selection of a family representative for the Central 46. Yamamoto frowned, even as things finally made sense to him. This was a political squabble over the whole Yoriyuki Shihoin situation. He had used his authority to revoke her exile, as it was only proper, given that the woman had been proved innocent and they might need her to participate in fighting Aizen before the functioning of the government could be re-established. Letting her waste in a cell until the court could be assembled to pardon her properly was simply not a sound military decision in the current circumstances. However, that created a problem within the Shihoin family. The less traditional portion of the family, which in itself was by far the least traditional of all the great 46, had taken a political setback when Yoriyuki had been exiled, and her being proved innocent had suddenly upended the family dynamics. This was made more complex by the fact the woman herself had delayed answering over whether she would be willing to accept being reintegrated into the Godi 13, despite the urgency of filling the 2 empty spots as captains left by Aizen's actions. And of course, while any Shihoin with captain-level skills would usually be given command of the Omnitsukido, taking the role from Swafon and transferring her would be insulting for a Shinigami who had proved herself one of the most loyal and competent captains in the story of the Godi. It was an admittedly somewhat tricky situation. He had given the matter little thought, as the Shihoin, while once considered highly influential as the family that brought the art of Ho-Ho to the alliance that forged Seoul society, had lost enough political capital in the last century to only be able to truly influence perhaps 6 of the other great 46 families. With the traditionalist bloc, composed of 12 families and led by the Hyasub, already having provided Yamamoto a list of their own candidates, the confusion among the Shihoin wouldn't have mattered if the Kukaki had been willing to provide their own candidate, and encouraged their allies to do the same. The Central 46 needed 3/5 of the sitting positions to be occupied to be able to call a session, and while some decisions required full attendance or even unanimous consensus to be carried out, and thus the ability of the Central 46 to properly govern would be diminished until all the seats were filled, reaching the quorum that would have allowed for government functions to restart only needed the Kukaki to be willing to cooperate. Whereas, with them intentionally imposing an impasse, it was simply impossible for normality to be restored until the Shihoin situation was sorted out. Of course, if he accepted Byakuya's request here, that would solve the matter immediately and provide the ability for the government of Seoul society to be able to function once again, but he was reluctant to do that. Ichibe, as the son of one of the original 13 captains of the Godi and with his position as a seated officer in the 1st Division combined with his role as head of the Hyasub family, was the most influential voice for the preservation of the traditions Seoul society had been founded upon, and any damage to his position would damage the traditionalist power bloc. The man also had no clear successor, and the very fact he'd led his coalition for so long would risk splintering the traditionalist families if he had to renounce the role. And even if Ichibe was occasionally harsher than Yamamoto himself would be in his place, the man had not steered Seoul society wrong so far, and emphasized policies that respected what the original alliance had been meant to accomplish, which made Byakuya's blatant power grab not sit well with him. Besides, Yamamoto himself wasn't a member of any of the great 46 families, and thus had no influence on decisions regarding the appointment of their representatives. He was impartial, and could not support any one faction over another, which dismissing Ichibe from his position would be. In addition to which, of course, he also didn't need to lose a fighter of Ichibe's caliber on the eve of an announced invasion. In the current situation, dismissing 1st Division's first seat Hyasub from his post would weaken the military power of the Godi to an unacceptable degree. Byakuya nodded, his Ryotsu gaining an overtone of acceptance. That is understandable, and I take it to mean that dismissing me from my post would similarly weaken the military power of the Godai to an unacceptable degree. Unless you intend to indicate that you believe my combat skill as a captain of the Godai to be inferior to that of your division's first seat. Before the Sokioku fight, Yamamoto would not have been sure, but now, knowing that Byakuya had been defeated by a mere boy, even if one wielding a powerful weapon and empowered by a Zero-capable hollow, he had little doubt Ichibe was the stronger of the two of them. However, he could not openly say so. Within the rules of nobility, it would be considered an insult, and thus give Byakuya reason to request a formal duel with Ichibe. Considering how determined Byakuya seemed to be in removing the older man from his position, such a fight would carry to high a risk of one of the two, likely Byakuya, dying and starting a blood feud, which would only exacerbate the current difficulty. Thus, Yamamoto let a bit of denial into his Ryotsu, before answering stately. Of course not, Captain Kukaki. You may go, but please try to hasten the decision process of your family in selecting their candidate as much as you are able. The stability of Seoul society requires a proper government to be restored to its place as quickly as possible. We shall endeavor to provide a viable representative as soon as our concerns over the military emergency are addressed, Captain Commander. On behalf of the Kukaki, we thank you for your patience. Yamamoto didn't react to the cheek, merely nodding in a dismissal that Kukaki took with his usual unflappable attitude, turning on his heel and leaving with a steady, secure gait. The whole matter felt, to Yamamoto, supremely distasteful. Such political maneuverings had never been something he liked, and even as he understood the necessity of it to ensure proper governance, he had no interest in being involved in it. The Godai 13 was meant to protect the existing order, not bow to the will of any form of political pressure, and the sooner Yamamoto could return it to that neutrality, the happier he would be. He could only hope that Byakuya and Ichibe would sort out this disagreement between themselves as soon as possible. His musings were interrupted by Kojiro showing up, with a report from the 4th Division's headquarters that Toshiro Hitsugaya had finally woken up, so Yamamoto headed there to speak with the boy. According to what Retsu had told him, the wounds Jin had inflicted on the various people he'd fought were like nothing she'd seen before. Luckily, one of her subordinate knew how to treat them and she naturally improved on the process, but she'd raised the possibility that, while Jin's Bankai allowed him to cut through anything, it was possible the mechanics of it were different from what they had previously believed. Given it was a matter of both healing and Zanjutsu, Yamamoto was willing to trust her expertise on the matter. He wasn't overly worried about it, however. Even if the Bankai had some trick to it, no conceivable subtle application of an ability to cut through things was going to save Jin if Ryujinjaka's fire managed to get to him. He pushed thoughts of the traitor captain out of his mind as he reached the ward where Hitsugaya was being held. The boy looked paler than usual and had a very defeated expression, but he tried his best to steel himself into a presentable position. Yamamoto appreciated the effort of his subordinate to show proper respect despite his conditions, especially after Byakuya's annoying efforts to involve him into his politics, so he nodded in greeting to the boy and said, in a reassuring tone, "At ease, Lieutenant. Your prompt recovery is more important than formalities at this time." The boy sagged at that, the relief at his muscles being allowed to relax leaking slightly into his Ryotsu even as he tried to not show it. Yamamoto politely ignored that, accepting the soft, "Thank you, Captain Commander," with a neutral expression. He took a moment to take in the physical state the boy was into, and found himself satisfied that, despite the wounds, Hitsugaya didn't look too weak. He would probably be able to get back on his feet within a couple of days, which just confirmed to him the correctness of his plan of action. Without letting any of his thoughts show on his face, Yamamoto asked Hitsugaya, in a serious tone, "Have you been informed over what transpired while you were unconscious, Lieutenant?" The boy nodded, his white hairs falling on his face a bit, and he answered in a slightly hesitant tone. "Captain Unohana said that the Jin, was working with Aizen, who had faked his death, was the one who issued the fake order of executing Rukia, and that they have now joined a hollow army to invade us." "I didn't misunderstood anything there." "You did not." That confirmation caused the boy's eyes to darken as he said, in a tired tone, "Then I failed utterly, didn't I? If I had been a little stronger, a bit more skilled, I might have defeated Jin, and stopped this treason in its tracks." His first gripped the sheets he was covered by, and then he muttered, "I'm really worthless," in a low tone clearly meant more for himself than Yamamoto. Still, the captain commander decided to react to the words anyway, since it would help him make his point. "You're not. I spoke with 12th Division's 2nd Seat Hinamori, and her words persuaded me that you did as well as could be expected to, under the circumstances. Because of this, I would ask you, Toshiro Hitsugaya, to step up and accept the position of captain for the 3rd Division." The boy's eyes widened at that even as his head snapped up to look at Yamamoto in disbelief. "What? But, why? Captain Commander, I failed to defeat the man responsible for all this, and I don't have the full qualifications for the role," and Yamamoto raised his hand, stopping the boy's babbling, and then spoke to him in a direct, serious tone. "Jin Ichimaru is a Zanjutsu Grandmaster. His strength is above the average level of competence of a captain, and he struck by surprise in a situation meant to create confusion and psychological harm. Being unable to stop him in such extreme circumstances is not something I would blame you for." After all, Yamamoto knew, the boy would be doing plenty of blaming of himself on his own. It was a good thing for it to be so. In Yamamoto's opinion, the more guilty Hitsugaya felt about having let Jin slip through his fingers, regardless of how unavoidable an outcome that had been, the more motivated he would be to take the man down. He was, of course, just as unlikely to succeed at it as he had been to stop the man before, but with such motivation, he might be just enough of an impediment to Jin's actions at a crucial time, or maybe weaken or wound him sufficiently, for somebody else to take advantage and deal with Jin after Hitsugaya's unavoidable defeat. Which was what Yamamoto actually needed from the boy. He let Hitsugaya start to say but before cutting him off again, in the same reasonable but firm tone. "As for your qualification, my talks with Hinamori confirmed that Jin declared you to have reached mastery of Zanjutsu during the fight with him, as that kind of recognition from a Zanjutsu Grandmaster is all that is needed to bestow the title. That means you now have it, and it is my understanding that was the only qualification you were still missing. Thus, you meet all the bureaucratic requirements to be bestowed the title." Visibly, Hitsugaya didn't look like he had been persuaded by the argument. Yamamoto himself wasn't. If he were to be honest, Hitsugaya was young and not ready for such a role, and mocking words from a traitor would not have been something Yamamoto would normally have considered as a valid endorsement. However, sending a division into battle against an enemy army without proper leadership would only create chaos on the battlefield. A poorly led one could at least be fielded and trusted not to get in the way of other fighters. It was likely Hitsugaya would die early on in whichever fighting Aizen was planning to bring to them, but however long he lasted, it would be how long as they would be capable of effectively putting more bodies on the field, and the 3rd Division was more likely to loyally follow their former lieutenant against their traitorous captain than anybody else. In fact, if Hitsugaya died at Jin's hand, as Yamamoto expected him to, that might even galvanize the division to fight on to avenge him, which was also better than being unable to field them at all. Which was why Yamamoto was not honest, instead doing his best to make sure the boy wouldn't refuse the title by saying. "And, of course, the 3rd Division is currently under heavy scrutiny by the 46 great families, as many suspect Jin might have left spies in their midst." That was a lie, obviously. Yamamoto doubted Jin would have trusted any rank-and-file Shinigami with his secret plans, but it made for an useful pretext to motivate Hitsugaya. "However, given how you went against Jin and almost died for it, nobody doubts your loyalty, and I, myself, have absolute trust that the 3rd Division was uninvolved with the man's machinations. If you were to take leadership of it, that would reassure many, and give both you and the Shinigami under your command a chance to cleanse the honor of your division from the stain Jin left on it. I imagine many of your subordinates would be glad of receiving such a chance." He saw it in the boy's eyes, the moment he accepted the responsibility, his expression hardening slightly before he eventually nodded, and said, his voice as firm as it could be with his wounds. "Then, I accept the honor you offer me in naming me to such a position, Captain Commander, and swear I shall be worthy of it. I have no doubts about your suitability for the task, Captain Hitsugaya. We shall have a ceremony for official confirmation of your title in the coming week, but for now, rest and recover, for you have much work ahead of you." The boy nodded, easily believing the platitudes he'd been fed, and Yamamoto moved to take his leave, only to be surprised by finding Rangiku Matsumoto, the lieutenant of the 10th Division, waiting outside the door. Even as the buxom blonde woman bowed to him, Yamamoto frowned. Unlike Hachugaya and Captain Yodomaru, Lieutenant Matsumoto, despite having been defeated by Jin, had not been inflicted nearly impossible to heal wounds when the man had struck her. Instead, the hit had somehow knocked her entirely unconscious without inflicting her any real harm, other than a small cut on her belly that had bled heavily in the moment it had first been inflicted, but did not otherwise put her in any serious danger. On one hand, if Jin had left any plant behind to spy on his behalf, then this woman was the most likely possibility. Not only had she been left almost unharmed, but from what he recalled, she and Jin had been romantically involved, which made her even more suspect. On the other hand, it was entirely possible that he'd just pretended to kill her for the sake of fooling his allies. If that was the case, then Jin believed he couldn't turn her to his side, but didn't have the will to get rid of her, probably because of their relationship, and keeping her around might provide them with a psychological weapon to deploy against the man. Given this, Yamamoto was somewhat willing to let the woman go free for now. He was not, however, inclined to let her intrude into his private conversations. Thus, he asked, his tone somewhat severe. "Is there any reason you're here, Lieutenant Matsumoto?" She nodded in a polite fashion, and answered confidently. "I'd come to visit Toshiro, Captain Commander. We've been friends for some time now." Then she paused, and continued, more hesitant. "I overheard what you said to him, is it true? Are you making Toshiro into a captain?" He raised an eyebrow at the brazenness with which she was questioning him, but when he saw the way she stood her ground, despite suddenly looking quite unsure of herself, he decided it might be worthwhile to inquire as to her reasoning. "What business is that of yours, Lieutenant?" She swallowed, clearly properly reticent to demand anything of him, which he approved of. It was the correct level of deference to have. Still, he could see that she was gathering her courage, so he let her do so, until finally Matsumoto got herself under control and said, the hesitation in her voice only barely noticeable. "Then, Captain Commander, if you would allow it, I would like to be reassigned from the 10th to the 3rd Division, to become Captain Hachugaya's lieutenant." That caught him by surprise, as it wasn't what he had expected. "I was under the impression that you had held the title of lieutenant far longer than Captain Hachugaya. Why would somebody as experienced as you be willing to subordinate themselves to a younger and less experienced leader?" She looked surprised at the question, but nevertheless answered promptly. "Because Toshiro needs somebody to help him. I do not doubt he has the skills, Captain Commander, or you would not have promoted him, but I think he might not be in the best psychological position at the moment. And having to nominate a lieutenant from among the 3rd Division's seated officers might create chaos in their ranks at a time when we need as much unity as possible. I believe that having somebody with proven experience to help him, somebody who understands the psychological stress he's undergoing and can share the burden, would help him be more effective, as well as being far better for his emotional well-being." Yamamoto considered the proposal, and couldn't find anything objectionable in it. Limiting disruptions within the 3rd Division's chain of command would be best, and of course, if Matsumoto really was a weakness for Jin, then giving her to Hachugaya lent the boy one further weapon with which to harm his former mentor, while at the same time making it so that, if she was a plant, the person with the greatest interest into finding out would be supervising her most of the time. Overall, there was no real reason not to grant Matsumoto's wish. He just had to ensure that the transfer proceeded following the proper channels. "It would be a grave abuse of my authority if I were to take the initiative of transferring a lieutenant out of a captain who had given me no reason to discipline her so, Lieutenant Matsumoto. I will not demand that of Captain Yodomaru when she has not herself requested that such a transfer be approved." Matsumoto was surprised for a moment, but then quickly shook her head and said, firm. "Do not worry, Captain Commander, Lisa and I are longtime friends. Once I talk with her she will agree with me that this is the right thing to do." He shrugged, giving no hint that he thought the idea was excellent, merely answering in a neutral tone. "Then, once I shall have received a proper formal request of transfer from Captain Yodomaru and a request for a lieutenant from Captain Hachugaya, I will not have any objection to authorizing this transfer." The woman smiled dazzlingly, but Yamamoto had long grown past any interest in feminine wiles, so his only reaction to the woman's enthusiastic words of thanks was to nod and go his way, leaving her to go meet with her future captain. He was on his way out of the 4th Division's headquarters when Retsuo Nohana moved to walk at his side, with a relaxed step as she said, in her usual matronly tone. "If you are still interested in speaking with the mortals before we send them on their way, I have them all collected in a room for you to meet." Yamamoto sighed. While he could have hidden it, with Retsu there would have been no point. She was the only other survivor out of the original 13 captains that had been there at the foundation of the Godai 13, and that made her the closest thing to a true equal he had. Pretending between the two of them would be no more than useless posturing, since they were perfectly able to read each other's moods and intentions, and in a sense, he appreciated the directness with which he could speak with her. The fact that she was also the only soul in existence he was not sure he could actually defeat in combat also helped in keeping things as informal between the two of them as they did. Thus, he let his annoyance freely show as he answered. "You know that it's less than I want it, and more that I must meet with them. Considering what they told us in the individual questioning, it is extremely likely that the Vizard are still hiding in their hometown, and that Aizen will attempt to reach to them, either for vengeance or to try and subvert them. We need a quick response force on the ground that is familiar with the territory, and considering all of them seem to have power roughly comparable to a lieutenant, having them be the core of that force and coordinating with whomever we can spare to protect the area would greatly simplify the matter." Retsu nodded, before an amused smile formed on her lips as she added. "I asked Captain Komamura to collect the Kuratsuka for the conversation, since the Quincy, Urayu Ishida, was very vehement he wanted him present. I got the impression he had some serious questions he wanted answer to from the man, and I supposed letting him have them would make him more cooperative." Yamamoto frowned at that. He had hoped for the discussion to be calm, but that was unlikely to happen if they had to deal with Mayuri's ego at the same time. The man barely qualified as a captain, and Yamamoto suspected Aizen had worked on ensuring he had the certifications before faking his death specifically so that he would be forced to hand the man the title and have to deal with his delusions while Aizen's plan unfolded. And of course, Retsu, who absolutely didn't care if a situation devolved into total chaos, since none of it would ever affect her and nobody would be so stupid as to get her involved into it, had jumped on the chance to provoke some of it. He was annoyed, but not so much he would deny her the chance for some entertainment, considering how boring he expected having to take care of idiots who couldn't keep themselves together throughout a fight had to be, and how much time Retsu dedicated to doing just that. Besides, this were her headquarters, so she wouldn't have allowed things to go too far. Hopefully. On the other hand, making sure would not hurt. Thus, glancing back to the woman, he asked in a serious tone. "I hope you didn't leave them there unsupervised." "Oh no, don't worry. Yukatake is there with them, as Miss Kukaki wanted to introduce him to her friends. I'm sure he'll be able to keep things from coming to blows. And Captain Kukaki mentioned he would show up soon enough." That sounded remarkably like Retsu had organized the whole thing purposefully to make things as difficult for him as possible. He wasn't so gullible as to think she didn't knew of Kukaki's political play when she'd invited to the meeting everybody who was likely to have a grudge over how close the Kukaki girl had gotten to be executed. Which meant Retsu wanted to annoy him into some sort of concession, since he could not imagine any other reason she would have gone for the people more likely to question any decisions and comments he made, rather than call upon people who'd be more compliant and able to push the mortals into doing what he needed them to do. Before he could ask, Retsu motioned to a door and said this way, and Yamamoto found himself entering a room that looked a bit less chaotic than he'd expected. Rukia Kukaki was waving her hands widely as she spoke to a orange-haired punk and a girl with messy black hairs, gesturing to an embarrassed Jushiro behind her while Abarai, who he had not expected to be present, seemed to be almost preening, even if he wasn't sure what the boy would have to be happy about, since it wasn't any accomplishment of his they were discussing, seeing as he didn't have any. In fact, going by the attitude, Kukaki was explaining that Jushiro had finally persuaded her in taking the role as her lieutenant, which in Yamamoto's opinion only ought to make Abarai feel embarrassed his own lack of worth, rather than be happy. Yamamoto himself wasn't sure what to make of that particular development. On one hand, Jushiro finally stopping his obstructionism and filling the vacant role was a good thing, as the man's insistence on not doing so for 2 whole years had really made interactions between him and more rule-abiding captains tense. On the other hand, Jushiro had defied him for the sake of Rukia Kukaki, and the girl herself, purely on her own, had been capable of mustering a worrying amount of support in standing against the laws of Soul Society. Even if in the end it had been found that she'd been condemned on false pretenses, Yamamoto was not persuaded that all members of that group had been aware of the fact, which made the Kukaki girl a potentially highly subversive element. Giving her the increased political influence that came with Jushiro, making it clear she was pretty much his designated heir to the leadership of the 13th Division, especially at a time when Byakuya was making some sort of political bid for power, was a decision that inspired very controversial feelings in Yamamoto. Still, at least her presence was keeping that portion of the group calm. The others were much more animated, as Mayuri and the bespectacled Quincy were hissing insults to each other with barely restrained civility. A tall and dark-skinned teenager was keeping a hand on the Quincy's shoulder to stop him from launching himself at the 12th Division captain, while Mayuri was occasionally glaring at Byakuya, who was leaning silently against a wall at the room's corner behind him, clearly indicating the 6th Division captain had already interfered to keep things from coming to blows. It helped that the area between the two, where a small table was, had been taken over by the huge figure of Komamura, to whom the stupidly naive, orange-haired girl was speaking in her annoyingly loud voice, with Nimue Kuratsuka clearly following along and occasionally contributing a short sentence. It seemed that the Fullbringer had somehow persuaded the artificial Shinigami to craft some strangely square brush with hard metal tines, and was encouraging Komamura to try it out on his head, and the dog-headed captain seemed to appreciate it. Yamamoto had vague memories of him complaining that traditional brushes didn't work properly for him. He wasn't sure what the airhead could possibly have said to bring the matter up, however. The matter of Komamura was another one that Yamamoto had wanted to leave for later. Apparently, when an unharmed Zaraki had brought an heavily wounded Komamura to the 4th Division's headquarters to be treated, Komamura's secret had become public. That was quite annoying to Yamamoto, as it both created tension within the ranks and weakened his hold on the dogman's loyalty. The first was expected, as not everybody understood that Komamura's looks had little importance when the man was as powerful and doggedly loyal as he was, and shunned him for it, just like Komamura always feared. It was one that Yamamoto was confident he could quash by visibly punishing anybody who dared to openly disrespect a captain on such basis, and he was looking forward to having that chance to put upstart that the looks were more important than loyalty and willingness to fight for Soul Society in their place. However, having been the only one to know about the captain's looks and have accepted him anyway had been one of the key elements in Yamamoto's securing of Komamura's loyalty. The fact that he could now see the possibility of others doing the same, like the Fullbringer obviously was, in which the Kuratsuka girl seemed willing to go along with, put that loyalty at risk at a time when the individual closest to the man had just defected. It was a security risk that Yamamoto would have avoided if he could, and exposure to the headstrong girl who seemed to believe she knew better than him was not something Yamamoto would have approved of, had he been able to set up this meeting on his own terms, rather than having Retsu spring it on him. With that in mind, he felt that he was somewhat entitled to let some annoyance in his voice as he said, "Kurt, I would like to get this reunion over with as soon as possible, as my tasks take over much of my time. So, if you all would be silent and pay attention." To her credit, Rukia Kukaki was quick to bow respectfully, faster even than Komamura's own straightening of his position, as she said in a polite tone. "Of course, Captain Commander, we didn't mean to be disrespectful, we were merely passing the time while waiting." That was when Jushiro spoke up, in a more relaxed tone and placing a protective hand on the girl's shoulder, even as he looked straight into Yamamoto's eyes. "Don't worry, Rukia, I'm sure the Captain Commander understand how, after the injustice you were subjected to throughout last week, you might need to relax a bit with your friends when you have the chance." The girl looked embarrassed at Jushiro taking her defense like that, but Yamamoto didn't fault her. He knew that Jushiro was currently still annoyed because of their little confrontation. His student, in Yamamoto's eyes, was being simply unreasonable. After all, Jushiro had been the one breaking the law, and that he would hold having been fooled by Aizen against Yamamoto was proof he hadn't matured as much as he'd hoped he would have. Having too soft a heart had always been Jushiro's biggest weakness, but Yamamoto had believed that his student had learned at some point how to put that aside for the good of Soul Society. The fact that he hadn't been able to when the target had been somebody close to him was highly disappointing. Still, Yamamoto wasn't going to discuss that particular matter now, certainly not in the middle of an hostile crowd of strangers. Instead, he merely nodded and said, in his most serious and professional tone, "Naturally. Now, I will answer any questions you have that I deem reasonable, and then make a few requests of you that it would greatly benefit everybody if you were to accept." And why should we do anything you ask of us, or believe any answer coming from the lips of a murderer? Yamamoto turned the full focus of his attention on the glaring Quincy. He narrowed his eyes and let some of his gaze burn with intensity, a tactic that tended to make people cower and act more reasonably when they remembered who they were dealing with, but the Quincy was left unshaken. That spoke of having some amount of determination, for somebody whom arm Yamamoto had personally shattered. On the other hand, perhaps it was to be expected that somebody who'd seen him fight at his full power would not be intimidated by a mere gaze. So, he limited himself to keep glaring at the boy as he said, in his most absolute tone. I don't know what you mean, young man, but I am no murderer. I only kill those who commit crimes deserving of death under Soul Society law. I have killed Quincy, but that was during times of war, and the last of that was about 120 years ago. Is that what you are complaining about? The Quickie looked furious as he said, pointing his finger at Mayuri. He tortured my grandfather only 9 years ago. Was that part of your precious war as well? Yamamoto didn't even look at Mayuri. The man was insufferable and disgusting, but he would not have broken a law of Soul Society so openly. Instead, he delivered his answer with absolute certainty. He did no such thing. He said he did himself. He was proud of it. Of course I am. The results of those particular experiments went beyond any understanding of Quincy skill we ever had before. I blazed new ground and allowed for great new technologies to be created. Yamamoto slowly, very slowly, turned toward Mayuri at the man's explanations, and asked, in a very harsh tone. What do you mean, Captain Kuratsuki? The regulations for experimental human test subjects requires that such research only be allowed on consenting plus, any signed consent from a Quincy passing through my desk is something I would not have forgotten. Mayuri looked incensed at that, as if he couldn't understand why Yamamoto was annoyed to hear him say he'd broken Soul Society's laws. The man shook his head energetically and defended himself in a loud tone. That's not at all what I was said. The regulations I was given specifically stated that mortals were excluded from those restrictions. Yamamoto let some of his anger enter his riot suit, enough so for Mayuri to notice and start to sweat in worry, as he told the man, in no uncertain terms. Mortal souls have the same rights under our laws as any inhabitants of the Rokanga do. That, he noticed, caused the mortal girl with messy dark hair to glare at him, but before he could understand what, in his words, could possibly have upset her, Mayuri hurried to say, in a somewhat scared tone. That's not what the restrictions I had to follow said at all. I know how many envious, unscientific individuals would love nothing more than to see me in prison, so I never stray from the letter of the law. Nimue, am I wrong? There was a brief pause, and then the Kuratsuki girl said, in a neutral tone. I was not your assistant for experiment 4U517413NQ, father, but the documentation you had me memorize about it does include just such a provision to allow for experimentation on living Quincy. The Quincy boy looked furious at that, and Yamamoto himself felt like just giving the man Mayuri's head and being done with it for so openly breaking the law, until suddenly, Rukia Kukaki spoke up, in a very serious tone. Captain Mayuri, did you actually personally consult the regulations on the matter? The man scoffed at her, looking genuinely offended at the idea. Of course not. Aizen gave me my directives and specified which restriction I was to follow for that experiment. You know as well as me that was the procedure for every experiment, Kukaki. The girl nodded, then turned toward the Quincy and said to him, her tone sad. That's true, Urayu, of course. Normally a scientist should know the restrictions and check them constantly for any updates, and she glared at Mayuri there, making it clear she didn't excuse him for his lack of due diligence, but many people, especially careless ones, don't. I think Aizen purposefully tricked Captain Kuratsuki into it. Not that I think that excuses his actions, but... She trailed off, but the Quincy clearly was on her same wavelength as he concluded for her, in an angry tone, but it would be playing into Aizen's hands to kill this monster right now, when we might need him as a weapon against Aizen's hollow army. I understand, Rukia. The Quincy turned his glare on Mayuri, who was huffing in annoyance, and then moved his attention to Yamamoto himself and said, in a harsh tone. I will let this matter lie for now and until Aizen is dealt with, since he's just as guilty, and I won't let a man who contributed to my grandfather's death make me into his tool. But I will want some reparations to be made after this situation is over, and for you to explain to us why stopping Aizen is so important. That caused everybody else in the mortal group to look at him with open curiosity and, in some cases, expectations, which just added to the annoyance he was feeling toward Aizen, since this was all the man's fault. It was entirely within a captain's rights to control what information their subordinates might access. That was how the man had made Mayuri into a liability with this ploy of having him murder Quincy, and pitting these kids against Yamamoto with his parting comments, of which Retsu had warned him, was just another application of the same practice. Letting people have all the information they wanted was obviously not the solution, since that would make both his own job and that of the other captains that much harder to do. However, Yamamoto decided he should consider being personally more involved in what each captain was doing in the future. Not so much as to limit their power, since that too would make their job harder, only enough to make sure they didn't try to do anything too big without him being aware of it. Shaking his head and putting the plans for increasing his personal presence in the direction of the Godai 13 to the side, he instead focused on the crowd in front of him and said, in a serious tone, "I cannot give you too much information, as that would put the security of Soul Society at risk." The dark-haired girl scoffed, and the orange-haired punk frowned and said, in an annoyed tone, "Aizen said you would do that. My friend just made a big sacrifice to avoid playing into the man's hands, but you're not willing to do the same." Yamamoto glared, but the boy didn't seem to let himself be intimidated any more than the Quincy had. He wondered what it was to give these kids such a spine. Still, he ignored the disrespect for once, since if the determined expression on the orange-haired girl was any indication, none of them was going to budge, and instead said, in a serious tone, "I will tell you what you need to know. More than that would risk the information making it to Aizen, however, and we can't allow that." The tall boy at the back frowned and said, his tone more polite than any of his friends had been, "Would Aizen not already have all the information he needs?" That, Yamamoto decided, was the perfect way to de-escalate this situation, so he shook his head and lied, in a polite, respectful tone. "He doesn't. He merely thinks so. Just by saying you this, I'm risking our position, so I hope you understand how much trust I'm extending you with even giving you as much as I'm going to." There was doubt in all of their eyes, but he didn't really need them to believe him, only to stop questioning him and falling in line. So, he explained, mixing lies with truth to achieve his goal. The throne is an artifact that is connected to all the Zanpakuto. It might be correct to call it the first of them all, as other Zanpakuto were created by studying it. When a hollow's mask is pierced by a Zanpakuto's blade and purified, it is to the throne that it is sent, which then uses it as a source of power for the defenses that keep the Suryatai safe. At the same time, it ensures that the captured hollows can no longer trouble any soul by preying upon them. As we understand that the Hujioku allows for control of any hollows, and here he paused, to get a confirmation nod from the group, it is our belief Aizen plans to use it to absorb the power of all hollows contained inside, and use it as his own. The Quincy frowned, and asked, "And why would that not work?" "Because there are safeguards on the throne that Aizen is not aware of. While I allowed him to examine the throne a few times as part of some research he was making to improve Zanpakuto, every time I personally deactivated the security measures before letting him in, both to the door to the throne room and the ones surrounding the throne itself. As a result of this, despite his convoluted plot to strip the throne room of all protections and giving himself 3 whole days to get past the protections he couldn't deactivate, Aizen wasn't able to make it through, hence why he's now resorting to an invasion. If he can seize the palace, he thinks he'll have all the time he needs to break the defenses. But the traps around the throne itself are such that he won't be able to detect them, even if he knew to look for them, which he doesn't. And the moment he triggers the trap, he'll be destroyed by it." Everybody nodded, but then the orange-haired punk commented, with a frown, "So, if there is this trap, then what's even the point of fighting him? Why not simply letting him enter the room and trigger the trap so it just takes him out, and we solve the problem?" Yamamoto answered quickly and in a tone that broke no compromise, to keep anybody from trying to follow along that line of thought. "Because the trap would also destroy the throne itself. This would free all the hollows we've captured over millennia, letting them free to rampage, leave us without any way to properly dispose of hollows, and leave all the defenses around Soul Society completely depot-ward. It would be a catastrophe. The group looked suitably shocked at the explanation, so Yamamoto crossed his arms and concluded. That is as much as I'm willing to tell you. I will not share any information about the defenses around the throne room of the artifact itself, so I hope you don't have any other questions. Everybody seemed to accept that, but the girl with wild dark hair asked, looking angry. So, if we have to stop the guy, which it sounds like we do, when do we go? I mean, I understand that getting your army ready will take a bit, but surely once they are, striking first is the best approach. Yamamoto could appreciate the girl's viciousness, so he was just as unhappy as her when he said we do not know where he's hiding. Hueco Mundo is vast, and while the 11th Division has mapped a large amount of the area closer to the perimeter of Soul Society, that's nowhere near close to the entirety of the spiritual realm. We need to be reactive, for now. They frowned, and the annoying girl with the orange hairs said, in a tone that sounded almost offended. So we're going to just wait and do nothing? True heroes would find a way to stop the villain, not wait for evil things to happen to innocents before they act. Before the kids could take that idea somewhere stupid, Yamamoto spoke up again, in a firm tone. We do have a plan of action. I heard that the visored Aizen created might be hiding in your hometown. The dark-haired girl suddenly looked defensive at that as she said what of it? In a wary tone. Yamamoto didn't let his satisfaction at her confirmation of the information show, instead merely saying, in a conciliatory tone. Then, we suspect that Aizen will try to reach to them. They have reason to be angry with him, and now that we know they were innocent victims, we could make useful allies out of them. Aizen will be aware of this, and likely try to prevent it from happening, which is why we believe he'll try to reach to them before we could. The dark-haired girl frowned, but the Quincy said, shrewdly. So, you want us to contact them on your behalf, and persuade them to work with you? Yamamoto nodded. In part, we want you to collaborate with a group of Shinigami we'll prepare for the job, to help them set up a trap that we can use to learn where Aizen is hiding, and strike at him before he can strike at us. The dark-haired girl grinned at that, smashing her fists together in an excited manner. Meanwhile, the punk let out a long breath and said, sounding tired. I suppose that makes sense. So, who is this group going to be composed of? To that, Yamamoto had no ready answer. Karakura Town, the place these kids came from, was normally under the surveillance of the 9th Division, so in more usual circumstances, he would have sent people from it to deal with the matter. However, with how Tuan had left the division without leadership, that wasn't going to be a practical solution. He would need to talk one of the captains from a different division assigned to the Mortal Realm to do it, which he'd not yet done because, as a rule, Mortal Realm captains didn't like it when territories were added to their control area, as it increased their workload and created a lot of trouble with the schedules. Given the emergency, he would likely be able to persuade one of them to do it, but he'd not yet done so, as he'd wanted to secure the cooperation of the mortal kids first. Thus he said, in a diplomatic tone. We have not yet assigned the task to any group, although it will have to be a Mortal Realm division - then I would like to volunteer the 6th Division for the task. Yamamoto turned toward Byakuya, but the man was keeping the neutral expression he tended to prefer. This was obviously some sort of power play, but Yamamoto wasn't sure of which sort, and not having to deal with persuading anybody to take on the job was too convenient an opportunity for him to simply pass up. Thus, he found himself nodding and saying, in a neutral tone. Of course, Captain Kukaki, if you have no trouble with taking such a task on, I can leave it to you. Byakuya shook his head and answered, in a mild tone. Naturally, both as a captain and as a member of the Kukaki family, I find that it is our duty to do our best to ensure that we can solve any military problems Soul Society is facing as fast as feasible. Yamamoto kept his frown hidden as he understood what was going on. Byakuya was going to present this to the great families as a concession he had to make to be allowed to delay his nomination for a new member of the Central 46, which meant that, if Ichibe tried to meddle with that situation, Yamamoto would need to intervene and stop him, since doing otherwise might compromise the operation to get rid of Aizen. This kind of subterfuge was why Yamamoto didn't like to have anything to do with politics. Still, he merely shrugged, and said to the group. So, I think that is everything we needed to speak of. Actually, I'd like to make a request, teacher. Yamamoto turned toward Jushiro, and the man said, in his usual respectful tone. While I would not pretend to intrude in Captain Kukaki's duties, I want to emphasize that the situation with the Vizard is of interest to my division, as the manner by which the Vizard transformation has been achieved involved experimental keto. As a result, I would like to add an observer of my own to the mission. Yamamoto could see the demand in Jushiro's eyes. He got the sense the man would not be willing to have a civil conversation with him to settle their differences, which he had planned to have sometime in the upcoming week, if he denied him this. Yamamoto turned toward Byakuya, and the 6th Division captain politely inclined his head and said, in a respectful tone, "If Captain Yukitake deems it important, we would of course collaborate with any envoy he would send us." Yamamoto got the sense the two men had agreed to this beforehand, but he had no real problem with it, if anything, ensuring that Rukia Kukaki was in the mortal realm working for the Godi, rather than capitalizing on her newly acquired lieutenant rank to create more political problems at home, would make Ichibe more willing to stomach the situation with Byakuya's power grab. Thus, he nodded and offered his agreement, before leaving the room, Retsu following after him. He waited until they were in a long, empty corridor until he stopped and told her, letting his annoyance show. "You organized that with Kukaki on purpose, Retsu, isn't it?" "Of course." The woman offered her usual matronly smile at that, and he let out a long breath. "So, get on with it. What was the point of all this?" Her expression went more serious at that. "I want you to give me authorization to train Zaraki into unlocking his Bankai. If I am given 3 months to work on it with him, I am sure I can set his head straight and push him into achieving it. We need as much power as possible to face Aizen's army, and nothing else could provide us more than doing this." Yamamoto stood silent for a bit at that, as he considered the matter. When Anohana had moved from the 11th to the 4th Division and named Zaraki her successor as captain of the 11th despite his lack of the normal qualification, the Central 46 had voted in an emergency session that he was not to be trained any further, as they were terrified that, if he achieved Bankai, he might just become impossible to control. In protest, Anohana had made a vote of pacifism, that she would not fight except in defense of herself, until she was allowed to train Zaraki to achieve his full potential. In a way, it had been an attempt from Ritas to force the issue and protest the decision. At the time, many in the 46 families had hoped that her taking command of the 4th would lead to the healers and the 11th working together in their incursions into Hueco Mundo, something which had the potential to allow Soul Society to actually expand and conquer the rest of the spiritual realm, instead of being confined to as small an area as the still controlled. By making her vow, Retsu had put a stop to that, obviously hoping the great families would reconsider if it interfered with their expansionist plans. However, the move had backfired, as many members of the Central 46 had instead felt safer in knowing that the first Kenpeikai was not going to fight anymore, and thus, things had remained like that, since only the Central 46 themselves could repeal such a law. That is, except for in circumstances of martial law, in which case he, as Captain Commander, could repeal the decree, if only temporarily. It would need to be confirmed by the Central 46 once they convened again to actually be struck from the books, but Yamamoto somehow had a strong suspicion that Byakuya would not be able to provide a representative for his family until Retsu was satisfied Zaraki needed no more training, at which point it wouldn't matter anymore. Sometimes, Yamamoto forgot how scary of a woman Retsu could be. Even with that, however, it was, ultimately, his decision. If he refused, things would remain at a stalemate for now, but eventually even Byakuya would need to bow to the will of the other families or lose his influence. If he wanted, he could just deny her. "Why should I allow this, Retsu? You're clearly trying to circumvent the laws of Soul Society, and want me to enable you in doing so." She chuckled, in that soft, reassuring manner of her, and countered. "If you agree to it, it's not against the law, is it? You know what I mean." "So I do. You should allow it because they had no right to make a decision over a Shinigami's personal life, because you know this is something that will make the Godi much stronger at a time they need it, and because I really want to be able to kill things again." A lesser man than Yamamoto would have shivered at the soft, affectionate way she'd said that. He considered it, but in the end he said, in a serious tone, "If I allow this, how will you ensure your pet doesn't decide to turn on Soul Society? You cannot deny he's a beast, and it's hard enough to keep him under control as it is." Retsu shook her head, and answered in a seraphic tone, I can and will deny it. You don't understand Zaraki, just as the idiots who passed that stupid laws didn't. Zaraki doesn't need to be controlled, he need to be taught. Which is what I will do, if you deign to just trust me for once, instead of always wanting to do things your way. Yamamoto frowned. He was pretty sure he listened to what other told him and incorporated it in his decisions whenever it was sound advice. In fact, not doing things his way was the specific reason he was so determined to put an end to this martial law situation as soon as possible. But he knew Retsu, and if she refused her, she would just point at that as a mark of his inflexibility, and then proceed to engineer more trouble for him, without ever using any violence at all, until he reconsidered. Thus, he let out a long, tired breath, and nodded. All right. You have authorization to train Zaraki, so long as you don't destroy anything in the process. She smiled gratefully, and answered softly. Don't worry, I've spoken with young Kisuk, and he has just the place for it. Thank you, Genri Yusai, for listening to me this once. He nodded curtly, to which she bowed back respectfully, and then quickly left. After all, he wasn't one to dwell on past decisions or have regrets. If Retsu turned out to be wrong, and Zaraki proved to be the wild beast Yamamoto knew he was and went out of control, he would simply put him down himself. Right now, however, he had matters to see to. An invasion was coming, and he wanted Soul Society to weather it and come back stronger from it, which would only happen if he focused his full attention on making sure everyone was ready. Chapter 68, Talks. I'm so glad you're alright. Is that any way to make your old dad worry? Ichigo sighed, but unlike what he might have done at a different time, he didn't force himself out of his father's hug or stopped him from pretending to cry. As things stood, he didn't really have the energy to interrupt his old man's grandstanding declarations. How is a poor father to live a peaceful life with a son so irresponsible? When you called to say you would be gone for a few days to help a friend, I didn't thought that'd mean a whole week would pass without hearing from you at all. Anything could have happened to you, you could have died even, and I would have never known. That caused a sense of guilt to flare up in Ichigo's chest, because, while his father was exaggerating his worry for effect, Ichigo really had come extremely close to dying in Soul Society, and multiple times, at that. In fact, if Anohana hadn't been there to heal them all immediately, at least Ichigo himself and Momo, and potentially also Tatsuki and Chad, might not have survived Aizen's attack. Thus, there was a certain lack of conviction as he answered, tiredly, I didn't think it would take that long, in the hope that might stop Ashine. It did not. It did, however, cause Karen to chime in with a deadpan comment of her own. Come on, Dad, Ichigo is always claiming he's not the type to put himself in danger. Ichigo frowned, unsure how to take his sister's comment. It was true that he wasn't the type to simply put himself at risk for those he didn't know, but he had just come back from risking his life to help his friends. In fact, he'd always held to the belief that he wouldn't let something bad happen if he was there to stop it, but that solving every problem in the world or fighting every evil out there was not something he was taking on himself the responsibility to do, and he didn't feel his recent actions were completely out of line from that idea. After all, the trouble had literally walked to him and struck him down. However, he wasn't sure how much that justified his choices in full. Did it still held true that he wasn't trying to shoulder every evil around when he'd, however briefly, took arms against a government to stop an unjust execution, and almost died for it? Especially when, despite all his effort, he'd really not contributed much at all. In the end, it had been Tatsuki, Chad and Momo who had given Rukia the help she'd needed to free herself on her own, while all he had done was get stabbed by Jin and distract Byakuya for a bit before getting stabbed Aizen, and let the man steal the Hogyaku from him, instead of protecting it as he'd promised when Rukia had entrusted the weapon to him. Would him not interfering have been better, denied Aizen of the possibility to get what he wanted? Ichigo wasn't sure anymore. Still, he couldn't really discuss that with his father, not when he'd not let him know which friend he had gone to help and what sort of help she had needed, so he merely said, in a tired tone. Yeah, that's not my thing. That was answered by Yuzo gently adding herself to the hug, and saying in a serious tone. That's not true, big brother, you're much more kind than you think. Yeah, Ichigo, you're awesome. He sighed, and turned toward his friends, where Orium had her fists on her waist and was nodding decisively after her declaration, something that caused Yuzo to nod along as well. Ichigo was never really sure why it was that the two got along so well. Yuzo was a very down-to-earth person, enough so, in fact, that her sensitivity to spirits was much lower than the rest of the family, and Orium was about as close to having her head in the clouds as Ichigo thought it possible to be. Despite this, the two of them always seemed to be on the same wavelength, generally agreeing in their opinion on most things, when they happened to speak to each other. "Oh, thank you so much, my dear daughter and Miss Orium. It is a balm for a father to be surrounded by so much kindness and affection. To know I have a son who cares too deeply." That comment caused both Yuzu and Orium to nod along, in answer to which Ichigo could only sigh. Unlike with Yuzu, why Orium and his father got along wasn't difficult to understand at all. Ichigo wasn't sure why it was that, when his Hein's dramatic way of acting always managed to get on his nerves, Orium's quirkiness instead always seemed to put him more at ease. After a moment of thinking it over, he concluded that his Hein's overreactions always sounded a bit fake, somehow, as if he had to put effort into them, whereas Orium's felt much more genuine. It didn't change the fact, however, that if he allowed the three of them to team up against him, he wasn't going to get out of this anytime soon, so he countered, trying to put some energy into it but sounding somewhat flat even to his own ears. "I really don't, especially about a bothersome father who can't trust me to survive a week on my own." That caused his father to double down on his loud crying, as he turned toward the big poster of Ichigo's mom that was hung on the wall and said, in his most declarative tone yet, "Oh, Masaki, you tell me what I've done wrong, for my own son says that he hates me. If you give us a few minutes, Dr. Kurosaki, I'm sure we can beat some sense into him." Tatsuki punched her fists together for emphasis, which caused his Hein to turn to her saying, "I'm very grateful for your offer, Tatsuki, but I couldn't condone such violence. It'd go against my sacred oaths as a man of medicine," which at least allowed Ichigo to break free of his father's smothering hug. Tatsuki was grinning in the manner of somebody who was far too amused at the situation her best friend was into, and went on to say, in a falsely sweet tone that would have fooled no one, "Oh, don't worry, we'll not hurt him at all. Isn't that right, Chad?" Ichigo's tall friend placed one of his large hands on Ichigo's shoulder and nodded, which caused his Hein to break into tears again and said loudly, "To see such thoughtful friends were taking care of my poor, dumb, weak, cruel son fills this old man's heart with such pride, I could not deny you the chance to persuade him out of his rudeness." Ichigo fought his urge to start a proper fight with his father due to all the insults. Although he found that it was easier to resist the impulse, he wondered if that was a result of his extensive training in controlling the far more violent desires of his inner hollow, or if he was just currently too tired to care. Before he could reach a conclusion over the matter, Tatsuki took immediate advantage of his Hein's permission to drag him into his room, with Chad pushing him from behind and Orium following at the rear of the group, carrying the gym bag that contained Zanjutsu, Getsuga, and her own Zanpakuto. Once they were all inside his room, Tatsuki pushed him onto the bed before letting go to close the door, sitting on the stool next to it, while Orium sat on the bed next to Ichigo, pulling out his two swords and setting them onto the bed between them before zipping the bag close again. The last thing he needed was his father wondering why he'd brought his weapons along to help a friend, while Chad took place on the sturdy chair that sat at Ichigo's desk. Tatsuki rubbed her hands together, a decisive expression on her face. "Right, we should get to talking then." Ichigo groaned, letting himself fall back on his bed as he said, in a tired tone, "Please don't tell me you're going to try and cheer me up like my father wanted or something. I'm really not in the mood for such nonsense right now." That caused his friend to grin in that somewhat menacing manner of hers. "Why, do you think you need help in picking yourself up? Can't handle the exercise, need me to put you through your pace?" From his position, Ichigo could see the small smile on Chad's mouth at Tatsuki's joke, but Orium, of course, took it seriously as she leaned toward him and asked, worried, "I did notice you didn't seem your usual confident self. You know you can tell us if you need help in feeling better, Ichigo, don't you?" He took a deep breath, then mustered a somewhat shaky smile and tapped the girl on her shoulder in a reassuring manner, murmuring, "I'm sure I'll get better once I've had a chance to sleep a bit, Orium, no need to worry yourself," before he pushed himself to a sitting position, causing Orium to move backwards with an almost hurried motion to leave him the space, and turning his full attention to Tatsuki. "So, what do you want to talk about then?" Tatsuki turned more serious. I wanted to discuss some strategy, to be honest. I have a couple of ideas, but I'd rather discuss them with you and see if you have some suggestions to make or alternative perspectives I should consider, rather than recklessly charging ahead. Ichigo couldn't help it as his eyebrow rose in surprise at her declaration, and even Orium had turned a surprised look on Tatsuki, enough so for their friend to say, looking just slightly embarrassed in a way she almost never did. Look, I've seen recently what happens if I'm reckless and what happens when somebody else comes up with a plan and I help put it into practice, okay? I'd rather not suffer the consequences of the former, and I rather like the absolute successes I can get out of the latter. So, lesson learned, let's come up with a plan first, rather than hoping somebody else does it for me when it's almost too late. That was not something Ichigo had expected to hear, but he could agree that, as far as positive benefits of their brief adventure in Soul Society, it was a nice one to have. Orium agreed, as she was beaming at Tatsuki with clear admiration and pride, causing Tatsuki to huff in annoyance. No need to be so surprised, I can learn from my mistakes just fine. You don't become a nationally recognized athlete just by bullying ahead without thinking, you know. Ichigo did know, and it lifted his spirit somewhat to see that Tatsuki had taken something positive from the experience. However, after a moment, he realized something else important, and asked, letting his confusion show. Shouldn't we wait to speak when Urayu is here with us? He's as involved in this situation as any of us, it doesn't feel fair to exclude him from the planning. Not to mention that, smart as he was, their Quincy friend was more likely to come up with good ideas than Ichigo would, in all likelihood. Tatsuki however shook her head, apparently disagreeing. I'd rather get this done as soon as possible, and it's not like we excluded him intentionally, he's the one who said he had to speak with his master as soon as possible. He can't fault us for having to speak things when he's not here when it was his choice to do something else. Ichigo wasn't sure how much that was fair to Urayu, since it wasn't like he could help having obligations to meet. Plus, the way he saw it, they had time. Rukia had said she would need to stay in Soul Society one more week, as she had stuff to discuss with her brother that she'd not been very clear about. And it wasn't only her, Urahara had promised he would come through, as he wasn't willing to simply rejoin the 12th Division when it'd mean having to accept Mayuri as his captain, and Yamamoto had been willing to postpone a decision on his precise role until the current crisis was over, to keep Urahara in a good disposition, since they needed his cooperation. Said cooperation was what would keep the man away for about the same time as Rukia. Apparently, once Orium's new friend Nimue had finished putting him back together, Urahara had joined in the sweeps his division was conducting to find any negation device Aizen might have left behind, only to locate about a dozen left in an area that the search crews had already made a sweep through. Which meant now they had him directing the search efforts, eating up a lot of his time and thus delaying how soon he could be joining them back. Why all the hurry though? It's not like we need to work out a plan immediately. Actually, we sort of do. Seeing his confused frown, Tatsuki elaborated. Even if Rukia will take a bit to arrive, when I last spoke with him Renji said he'd be moving the Mortal Realm headquarters of the 6th Division here tomorrow, so that's when he and most of the other Shinigami Byakuya reassigned to our town are going to be showing up. I worry that, if I haven't warned Hiyori's group about them beforehand, they might cut and run before we can organize anything, and that'd ruin everything. Ichigo hadn't really bothered to ask about whichever different times they would be seeing them again at when giving his goodbyes to Rukia and her Shinigami friends. He could see from Orium's surprised realization that she hadn't either. Chad didn't seem to react much, but with him, that didn't necessarily mean anything. Besides, as long as one of them had thought of it, that was all they needed, although that Tatsuki would be the one to think to ask Renji that did surprise him a bit. Apparently, she'd really gotten more thoughtful. He nodded to her, to show he accepted her point. Fair. So, what is it you wanted us to discuss then? Tatsuki looked a bit lost for a minute, then gathered herself, much as she usually did, and answered. Mostly how to approach the meeting. I'm planning to head there to talk with Hiyori as soon as we're done here, but I'm not sure on how best to get her on board. The Shinigami have hunted her and her friends for the last 100 years, and she's the type to hold grudges, so she might not be as willing to forgive and work with them as we've decided to be. We could just accompany you, and ask anything we think relevant if the situation calls for it. Tatsuki turned toward Chad at his comment, shaking her head and answering. I don't think that'd be a good idea. Ichigo's tallest friend leaned forward, a thoughtful expression on his face. Why not? Hiyori isn't the type to just met with everybody without forewarning, and springing an unannounced meeting on her when the whole purpose is to persuade her to meet other people would backfire, I fear. She did say she wanted a rematch with me, could you leverage that? Tatsuki actually paused to consider the matter, and Ichigo recalled that the Vizard she was training with was a member of the 11th. Considering what Ichigo himself had seen of Ikeku and Kenpeki, and what few comments Chad had about his own opponent and Renji about the rest of the division, he could see Chad's reasoning there. However, when Tatsuki eventually shook her head and said, "No, I think that would still lead to a fight, just, a more enthusiastic one, which isn't necessarily better," he found himself agreeing and nodding along. It really was better not to drop unexpected possible enemies or long-sought-after rivals on a member of the 11th Division if they could avoid it. Still, if there was another thing he could say about members of the 11th Division, it was that none of them had struck Ichigo as the type to let themselves be bothered if somebody didn't say to them in a proper manner. So, he had to ask, what's the worry here, exactly? Even if you're alone, you just tell her that Soul Society wants to hand over pardons to all of them, and they just need to show up. What are you worried about? Tatsuki looked uncomfortable, then said. I just worry that she won't believe me. Or think that I've been fooled, and the Soul Society is using me to lead her and her friend to a trap. You haven't heard the level of annoyance she speaks of Soul Society with, she wouldn't trust them at their word. I need a good idea to get her to agree to at least hear them out, but I don't have one. She opened her arms in an half-defeated gesture. So, suggestions. Ichigo thought over his meetings with members of the 11th Division in the past and ventured, not much sure himself whether it would help. Maybe try to make it a courage thing, or some sort of challenge. Like, if she's a true warrior she would take the risk, or something like that. Tatsuki blinked, apparently surprised, before grinning. That might work. Oh. How about we ask her friends to come speak with her? That's going to help, right? Everybody turned toward Orium for a moment, and Tatsuki frowned and asked, You met somebody in Soul Society who you think might be friends with Hiyori, Ori? Their friend quickly shook her head and explained. No, but you all did, right? Since Momo and Rukia became friends when they were working together, then surely some of the people in Miss Hiyori's division would be like her friends, right? Ichigo wasn't sure how well that would work for members of the 11th Division. On the one hand, he was inclined to think they'd be more likely to cause things to devolve into a fight, but on the other hand, Ikeku and the guy Chad had fought, Yumi Chika, had seemed like good enough friends. Maybe Orium had a point. He glanced toward Tatsuki who, after all, had a better chance to interact with the 11th Division, and asked her, You're the only one of us who spoke with them outside of a fight, do you think Orium's idea might have merit? Tatsuki seemed to think the suggestion over for a moment, before shrugging and saying, I think it's at least worth trying. She smiled, then said to Orium, They're not all that tightly knit together, but the group of the 11th I interacted with in particular all felt close enough that I think it's at least a decent idea. You don't think it might lead to even more fighting? That seems to be the way those people relate to each other and everybody else the most. Tatsuki shrugged at Chad's question, and admitted, maybe, but I would think that kind of fight could still lead to them working together afterwards, which Ichigo found himself agreeing on. It had been pretty clear that the members of the 11th Division just didn't see fighting the same way normal people did, and if Tatsuki worries that a fight might be unavoidable were well placed, then they were certainly the ones least likely to hold a grudge over it. Chad nodded along, then offered, in a thoughtful tone. You might also want to tell her that it matters to you, personally. I think that will strike a chord. Tatsuki frowned, and immediately shot that down, in a dismissive tone. I don't think it will. She's not the type to care deeply about anything, and she's known me for a couple of weeks at most, if that. Why would my opinion matter to her at all? But Chad shook his head. From what I grasped about her personality throughout my meeting with her, she cares more than she likes to admit. She might not openly say it if how the matter would affect you, personally, made her decide one way or the other, but I think it would be a factor. Well, I might as well try if you think it'll work, it probably wouldn't hurt anything, at least. Trust me, it will help. Tatsuki was still unsure, but then Chad went on, gazing straight at her, and it's also the right thing to do, to be honest with her. That seemed to steady Tatsuki's some, and she nodded with more conviction. You're right, she's teaching me honestly, and I at least owe her the truth for that. She smiled wryly, and added, even if I know it won't help any, to which Chad merely shrugged, happy of having said his piece. With that, Tatsuki clapped her hands, and got up from her stool with a determined expression on her face. All right then, I better get going, we don't have a lot of time to deal with this issue, I should get to it as soon as possible. Orium got up from the bed at that, hurrying to hug Tatsuki and tell her good luck then. In a warm tone, Ichigo couldn't help but grin a bit as he saw his black-haired friend closing her eyes and basking in the hug for a moment. He could understand that. Orium was great at hugging, she always put such energy in it that it often felt like she was passing that energy to you, and Tatsuki did look like she might need a bit of energy herself. Still, she let go after a moment, looking ready to go, at which point, surprisingly, Orium turned toward Ichigo and asked, in an eager tone. So, Ichigo, since Tatsuki is going to do this alone, maybe we could go train a bit. Ichigo blinked, he hadn't expected that. I thought you didn't like training that much, Orium. But you do. And I've been learning how to handle a sword from Nanao. I was looking forward to practicing with you and show you what I learned. Ichigo couldn't really say that to be an abnormal amount of enthusiasm coming from Orium, but he would say it was unusual when physical training was involved. He almost wanted to humor her for the sake of it alone, but luckily he'd had enough experience with his friend by now to know that, if he let her have her way every time, he'd never get to decide anything ever again, nor even have the time to. Her energy was just on another level from most people. But right now, Ichigo's own energy was pretty much depleted, so he let out a long breath and answered, in an apologetic tone. I would like to, Orium, truly, but I fought so much these last few days, I really need a pause. And you saw how worried Yuza was, I'd like to spend some time home today, to reassure her. Maybe even get my father to shut up, if I'm lucky. Tatsuki scoffed and said, that's not happening, to which Ichigo answered with a tired I know, but Orium seemed surprised and hesitant, although, Ichigo was happy to see, at least not visibly hurt or offended. As long as she didn't feel too bad about being shot down, he could deal with her being a bit disappointed. He wasn't expecting it, however, when she asked, a bit sad. You're really feeling that tired? He was, truthfully. However, that wasn't the whole of it. Inside, Ichigo knew that, right now, training had lost some of the luster it usually held for Ichigo. After all, when the time to put all of that training to the test in a real-world situation had come, a time where the training was supposed to make the difference and help him save his friend, he'd barely contributed, and then had failed at the one task Rukia had trusted him with above all others. He would need to train anyway, he knew it, especially with Aizen's nebulous world-ending plan looming on the horizon, but he knew doing it right now wasn't going to help him feel better. In fact, if anything, he suspected it might make him feel worse, and that wasn't something he wanted to subject either himself or his friend to. Yeah. I'm sorry, Orium. I need to decompress a bit, you know. Ichigo shrugged, not sure what reaction he was expecting, but it wasn't for her to nod and say, in an encouraging tone, I understand, or for her to suddenly move from Tatsuki's side to come wrap her arms around him and say, try to rest and get better, okay? It took a moment, but as he relaxed into the hug, Ichigo nodded. Still, he didn't break it quickly, taking a bit more to let the gesture of encouragement sink into him a bit, much like Tatsuki had before. After all, he really was feeling low on energy, and borrowing a bit of it from his friend wasn't something he was opposed to. Son, Orium let go, and his friends all waved and left. Ichigo let himself fall back on the bed for a bit, breathing slowly as he tried to rid himself of some of the sense of powerlessness, before he forced himself back onto his feet to head downstairs. He did wanted to spend some time with his family, after all, and he didn't think that staying in his room alone with his thoughts was going to help him any in his efforts of getting himself back together. He wasn't expecting for Karen to be just out of his door, leaning against the opposite wall with a deep frown on her face. Ichigo stood there for a minute, surprised, before eventually asking, as he took in the rigidness she was holding herself with. Did you want to ask me something? His sister locked gaze with him, as if to ensure she'd be able to tell if he was lying, before asking. "You were doing spirit stuff this whole week, weren't you?" Ichigo huffed, annoyed at her attempt to pry into his business. "What makes you say that?" "Because I searched your room and couldn't find your spirit sword, but now it's back in there." She motioned with her head toward where his bed was visible behind him, and Ichigo couldn't help his annoyance at that. "You went into my room while I was away? Even if it was locked?" Karen ignored the rebuke entirely, her gaze turning into a glare. "What were you doing?" Ichigo let out a long breath, running a hand through his hairs, before answering, in as reasonable a tone as he could manage. "Something dangerous, and it's better if you don't know any more than that. Besides, didn't you always say you didn't care about ghost stuff? I might care if it starts to make you look like this more often." Ichigo didn't have a ready answer to that one, so he sagged against his door and said, tired. "I'll try not to overextend myself like this again in the future. Does that works?" Karen held his gaze in silence for a few moments, before eventually offering a curt nod. "You better." Then she motioned for him to follow her down, which he did after closing his door behind himself, for all that it mattered when his little sister apparently knew how to pick the lock. Said little sister punched him on the arm lightly, causing him to glance at her, and she said in a serious tone, "Yuzo was worried you wouldn't make it back in time for next week, you know." Ichigo grimaced. It wasn't that he'd forgotten about the anniversary of his mother's death being about to come up, more that he hadn't considered that he might miss it if saving Rukia had taken too long. Still, he could hear what Karen was really asking, so he said, in as firm a tone as he could manage. "Don't worry, I won't be missing it. I promise." He could only hope that, whatever happened with their attempt to bring the Vizard on board with the plan, it would not cause him to break his word. The spiritual world and its trouble had already made his life harder enough, if it were to also ruin his family life, he wasn't sure he'd be able to take it. "And that's what the situation currently is, Master Haiwan." Uriu's master nodded, to signal he had heard, but didn't otherwise immediately comment, clearly thinking over the events that had happened in Soul Society as Uriu had relayed them. While he waited for his master to answer, Uriu took the time to study the reaction of his two fellow disciples to his tale. He had been surprised that Master Haiwan had wanted them to be present, but the master had insisted it was important for the information Uriu had to be shared with them as well. Hashwal was his usual serious, collected self, with a neutral expression on his face that was reflected in what Uriu could detect of their emotions. Kingdu was trying to hold the same facade, but even if his slim form was standing still, his blue eyes cold and the expressionless look on his face emphasized by the thin vertical scar over the side of his mouth, but underneath, Uriu could feel a churning, furious rage building up. It was only the fact that the master had not given any of them leave to speak any further that kept him from just saying whatever he wanted. Which, if Uriu was honest with himself, was likely to criticize his approach to the Soul Society situation. He'd edited his tale somewhat, making it seem like he'd only headed there in the hope of using the chance to testify in favor of Rukia as a mean to be able to present the Quincy grievances to Soul Society, and make it seem like he only cared about Rukia as a political mean to force concessions by leveraging the life debt she had with him, rather than because she was a dear friend. Yet even with that, the idea that he'd done anything that had helped a Shinigami wasn't something Kingdu was going to ever be on board with. Master Haiwan raised his hand then, dragging Uriu out of his reflection and pulling the attention of his two other students to himself, before saying in a thoughtful tone. "So, I imagine all three of you want to offer you their thoughts on these developments, and what we should do about them. Uriu, if you would start." Uriu nodded, bringing his full attention and focus to the fore before saying, in a determined tone. "I think we need to take advantage of this situation to gain influence over the Shinigami, by offering to help the Godei 13 in their fight against Aizen so long as they accept our conditions and change their laws concerning us. And with the debt one of their nobles owe me, I'm in the perfect position to coordinate something like this. We're never going to get a better chance than this." Kingdu immediately scoffed at that and countered, in an annoyed tone. "Why should we do anything like that, or care about what happens to them? They have never cared about what happened to us before. My proposal is to let them fight each other, and then, whoever wins will be so weakened and in such bad conditions, we can easily wipe them out entirely. That will solve the Shinigami problem in a much more decisive manner, without having to rely on their stupid laws, and hope they don't go around changing them again once they don't need us anymore. Uriah turned a glare on his fellow student and countered, letting some of his anger enter his tone. Do you even realize what you're asking? There's people in Soul Society who are innocent, and in fact the Shinigami treat them little better than they do us. I've seen them with my own eyes. Would you make us into mass murderers? The other Quincy's blue eyes focused straight on Uriah and he answered coldly. Of course not. I don't care a bit what the people in Soul Society do, so long as they don't have a band of armed killers to send after us. We wipe out the Goatee I-13, and keep them from ever reforming again. The civilians aren't our concern, but if we let their soldiers stick around, it won't be long before they go back to hunting us for sport again. Those civilians need the protection of the Shinigami you're so eager to exterminate to survive. If we take them all out like you want to, there will be nobody left to stop the hollows in Hueco Mundo from turning them into a quick meal. We need to find a less gruesome approach, like the one I just finished proposing. To do otherwise is irrational. King Du's voice grew low and dangerous at that, the fingers of his right hand flexing as if he wanted to clench them into a fist but was barely restraining himself. Irrational, is it? What is irrational about exterminating your enemies? I wonder if, instead, you haven't grown soft, Ishida. Have you gone making friends with the people who killed our families? Is that what this is, some flimsy attempt to make it seem like your betrayal of the Quincy they have killed across the years is the moral thing to do? Have you forgotten that Shinigami were the ones responsible for the death of all of my family, of your own grandfather? Uriah gritted his teeth to keep himself from just insulting the other Quincy, and instead took a brief breath before answering, in what he hoped was a polite, controlled tone. With what I found out about Aizen, he is the one responsible for my grandfather's death. In fact, what we know, the fact he, by his own admission, is going to work alongside an army of hollows, makes it clear that he is a threat to the Quincy that we should take care of anyway, and as soon as possible. And since he was behind what happened to my grandfather, who's to say he wasn't behind what happened to your family, as well? If anything, you should be roaring to be fighting against him as much as I am. He'd lost control at the very end, letting some of his frustration at the other Quincy's argument slip through. King Du snorted, clearly unimpressed, crossing his arms in front of his chest. I'm not going to let myself be fooled as easily as you were. Even if you're right, and this Aizen was the one behind the attacks, it's still Soul Society's fault. They should have reined him in, and if they actually cared anything about our people, they would have. And I'm not for a moment going to believe everything bad that Shinigami ever did to Quincy was because of the actions of this one man alone. Of course the Goatee would like to pretend that all that happened was the result of one bad actor they failed to control, rather than admitting his actions were only possible because of their own similar hatred and disdain toward our own. If he slipped out a leash, that meant it wasn't as tight as it should have been, and if they didn't notice, it meant they didn't care about what he was destroying enough to keep it safe from depredation. They're not innocent in this, and it disgusts me that you would treat them as if they were. Uriah met the other man's glare with his own and countered, barely keeping himself from vibrating in anger. That's still not reason enough to ignore the collateral damage of your plan, nor a good enough reason to not go against Aizen as strongly as possible to punish him for what he did. King Du leaned forward and countered, looking completely unafraid of Uriah. If he survives their clash, we'd take care of him at that point, and I say collateral damage is a necessary cost of seeing justice done. Justice? Or just blind revenge? Do you truly believe there's a meaningful difference between those two things at all? Uriah did, actually, but before he could elaborate on that, Master Haiwan clapped his hands, and that was enough to get both him and King Du to interrupt their argument and turn toward him. The man looked at each of them with an inscrutable expression, waiting until they both had slightly bowed their head toward him in respect, before finally speaking. It is clear that this is a matter dear to both of your hearts, my students, but I would ask that you maintain a respectful attitude toward each other. Yes, Master. Apologies, Master. The man nodded at their show of contrition, then went on. Now, I wanted to hear your opinion, but that included all three of you. They turned their attention to Hashwal, who had remained silent this while, and Haiwan asked, his tone serious. What do you think of the situation, nephew? Which one of your colleagues would you say is correct in their view of the situation? Neither, master. Uriah felt as surprised as King Du looked, but Haiwan merely motioned for Hashwal to further explain his point, which the blonde did after a brief nod, causing a long lock of hairs to fall over his face and for him to absent-mindedly push it back behind his ear. I think that, even as these two groups that have brought on to us great suffering fight each other, we have no good reason to involve ourselves, either during or after their spat. It shouldn't be any concern of ours what they do to themselves. Uriah frowned at that and couldn't keep himself from asking, confused. You would have us do nothing? The other Quincy nodded. Indeed. We have been able to remain within the limits the Shinigami imposed on us for the last 120 years, there is little reason to think things would change for us now, regardless of which party were to win. Thus, my suggestion would be absolute neutrality. We take no part, and continue with our lives the way they have been so far. Involvement would bring us nothing but ruin. Uriah didn't like the sound of that at all. While it might be sound in theory, Uriah did not believe Aizen would leave them alone if he somehow managed to win, and that was without considering the dangers of him accessing the throne itself. He decided to bring that up immediately. The risk is too great. From what we learned, Aizen's victory could result in an explosion in the number of hollows around, which would make life worse for everybody, and our mission as Quincy that much more difficult. Hashwal glanced at Uriah with a raised eyebrow, then asked, in a mild tone. You said that, during the fight in Soul Society, this Aizen tried to immediately access this artifact the Shinigami are protected, but failed, and escaped. That would imply he'd never have had any use for an army if his first plan worked, correct? Uriah wasn't sure what Hashwal was trying to prove with his speech, but it seemed right, so he just nodded. To that, the blonde offered a sad smile, shaking his head gently, before saying, Then I think you were lied to, Uriah. That left him very confused, and his fellow Quincy clearly noticed, as he went on to explain his reasoning. You see, I don't think the Godai 13 told you the truth at all. I think that this Aizen's plan was always to bring his army on Soul Society to conquer it, which is why he assembled one in the first place, and that the only thing he cared about was breaking down the defenses of their citadel, which you say he did. I do not believe anybody would be so twisted as to raise an army, especially one of Hollows, just as a backup plan. Instead, I believe that the leader of the Godai 13, the one you fought against, was impressed with the power of a Quincy and his allies, and wanted to bring you on board, to have you fight his war for him. King Du smiled at that, although there was no joy in it, as he commented. That'd be just like those Soul Society bastards, to only care about us when they can throw us against their enemies. Then, the scarred, dark-haired Quincy turned his full focus onto the blonde one and said, his tone growing harsher. However, I can't believe you'd be willing to just let them live. This is our chance to finally wipe Soul Society out, once and for all. How could we not take it? We can't let such a priceless opportunity pass us by. The vehemence in King Du's words didn't seem to affect Hashwal any, as he kept his polite expression on his face and countered, in a dismissive tone. It would just be an enormous waste of life and potential. We have no need to get involved into this fight, and so we should not. That is all there is to it, in my view. Well, your view is wrong then. I can't believe it, you're supposed to be the most skilled out of the three of us, and yet, you're just a spineless coward. This is our chance to get some long-deserved justice. You can't be seriously saying to me that I should let it pass me by like that. He seemed almost ready to punch Hashwal right then and there, but once again, Master Haiwan brought order by simply raising his hand in a manner that commanded the group's attention, before turning his attention on his most vocal student. King Du, I understand your anger, but when I took you in as my disciple after your family's death, you vowed to show proper deference and respect for my teachings. These undignified outbursts are shameful. The young man looked stricken by that comment, then bowed and said, in a humble tone. I apologize, Master, I let my anger control myself. I shall not dishonor you so again. Master Haiwan nodded and said, see that you don't, apparently satisfied with the apology. Then he turned his attention on all three of them, and went on to say, in a serious tone. You all have given me much to think about. One thing that is certain is that this event, even should we decide not to take advantage of it, is an unprecedented occasion that all Quincy should be made aware of. As such, I will be sending letters to all the Quincy clans across Japan, and to the most important leaders of Quincy communities across the world, with this information, so that they might fly here for a meeting. That is the only way to decide what should be done about this occasion Uriah made us so promptly aware of in a manner that would be beneficial to all of the Quincy. He nodded in Uriah's direction, and he couldn't help but feel a certain pride at the knowledge his master was acknowledging his efforts in Soul Society as having been more than worthwhile. He was, however, a bit taken aback when the master addressed him directly, with a severe expression on his voice. However, Uriah, much as I greatly appreciate your efforts, I must warn you that, until the meetings with the other masters is concluded, and a decision is reached, I do not want you to make any preliminary contact with the Shinigami with any offer, or even try to prepare the ground for one. Uriah was so surprised he couldn't help himself but ask, annoyed at the hesitation he could hear in his voice. Master, I don't understand. The man's expression remained severe as before, but his voice grew softer as he explained. I am not saying you are to have no contact at all, indeed, maintaining your current placement close to them, so you can keep us informed of any activity the Shinigami undertake, is something I encourage you to continue doing. However, you will not promise them our help, or suggest the possibility of such help to be coming. It might be that, at the meeting, I and the other masters shall act as you suggested, or we might decide to do as King Du asked, or follow the non-interference line Hashwal counseled, or possibly even reach some other decision that we cannot foresee in the present moment. Regardless, what you must understand is that the decision shall be taken by the authorities among the Quincy, not by an overeager student. Such an overstepping of your position would be punished most severely, Uriah, and I would not be able to protect you from the other master's judgment in such a situation. Do you understand me, my student? Yes, master. Uriah bowed respectfully. His master was only worried for him. Naturally, the man understood that, even if he'd not been as vocal as King Du, Uriah had just a strong conviction that his suggested path was the right one, and while Master Haiwan might forgive him the occasional overstepping, the Quincy leaders from other countries that would be coming would have their own standards. And, of course, even if Uriah's master was, to his knowledge, the older Quincy alive, other famous leaders had similarly impressive feats to their names, and would not take kindly to being ordered around, especially on matters of punishing somebody who dared to try and speak on their behalf without permission. Seeing that his message had been received and understood, Master Haiwan nodded to the group as a whole, before dismissing them, clearly having to worry over the organization of the meeting. The door had just closed behind them when King Du's first closed around the high collar of Hashwal's jacket, slamming him into the wall as he said, in a threatening tone. Why would you try and persuade the master that we should do nothing? If you don't care either way, you could have just said nothing, instead of cowardly trying to make it seem like I meant to disrespect him simply because I want justice for our people. How could you get in the way of that? Uriah wasn't too surprised by King Du's reaction, while Uriah himself looked to the master as a replacement of sort for his grandfather, since he'd taken over teaching him in the Quincy arts. King Du had pretty much been adopted. It was almost expected for him to care about the man's opinion even more than either of the two of them would. Hashwal was even less surprised than Uriah, glancing down at the fist holding him up against the wall before returning his attention to King Du and saying, in a dispassionate tone, I could because, unlike both of you, rather than focusing on my own selfish desires, I was looking to the well-being of all Quincy. Now, unless you want to start a real fight right in front of the master's door, and somehow hope he wouldn't notice, I suggest you let me go, as I have duties to attend to. Said duties being, Uriah knew, the training of lesser students. While only the three of them were good enough to merit Master Haiwan's time, Hashwal had a small crop of students of his own he was training for the Jagram family, as a mark of acknowledgement of his status as the best of Master Haiwan's students. King Du had always envied that to him much more than Uriah, perhaps due to the fact Uriah knew both of the other students were more experienced than him and thus didn't fault them for their skill, and Uriah could see the young man almost considering punching Hashwal anyway, before deciding it wasn't worth it, and letting go. However, before Hashwal could go, King Du pointed a finger at him and said, in a warning tone, Don't think I've forgotten that you spent a few years in one of the Quincy's communities in America. If I find out you're trying to use your connection with them to influence the decision, I'm going to be coming after you, and then we'll see if you're really so much better than me as you claim. I think you'll find that's just unfounded arrogance." Then, his finger swung from Hashwal to Urayu, as he added, "And if your sudden love for Shinigami causes you to go around preaching about your idea of working with my family's murderers to whatever delegations they send, Ishida, I'll be showing you why you're the weakest of us all. Get in my way, either of you, and you'll regret it." And with that, the man turned and left. Hashwal watched him go, then merely nodded to Urayu before leaving himself. Urayu, for himself, couldn't help but think over Hashwal's comment. Was the older Quincy right, that he was putting his personal preferences, emotions, and selfish desires above the well-being of his people? He'd not considered it. He knew he wanted a path forward that would hurt the least people possible, and hopefully only those, like Aizen or Mayuri, who deserved it, but he couldn't help but wonder if he was, perhaps, being too much of an idealist. He'd always considered himself a cynic, yet he'd almost come to blow with a fellow Quincy over the life of Shinigami, something only a few months ago he'd have considered impossible. Was he really on the righteous path, or was he losing himself to wishful thinking rather than facing out the harsh reality and tackling it pragmatically? For the first time in a long while, Urayu Ishida wasn't sure of the answer. Once they left Ichigo's house and Tatsuki went her own way to talk with her friend in the Vizard, Orium felt a bit stumped over what she should do now. She had really hoped to have a chance to train and speak and spend time with Ichigo, but he'd seemed really tired, and it would have been very egoistic of her to force him to do something that wouldn't make him happy. Even though normally, training always made him happy, it had seemed such a good idea, because Ichigo really had looked like he needed some help to be happier. But apparently even he could need to take a break from training sometimes, as surprising as that had been to hear. A soft tap on her shoulder caused Orium to turn around and realize Chad was still there. She smiled at her tall friend, glad to have some company at least for the walk home. Walking around with friends was fun, but doing it alone always left her a bit out of sorts, and often led her to get lost. "Sorry. I was thinking about Ichigo, and how strange it was that he would not want to train." Chad nodded in agreement. "It really is. Were you really looking forward to training with him so much?" Orium tried to remember if she'd told that to Chad before. She didn't think so, but it might be she was misremembering, or he might have figured it out on his own. He was smart like that. She also wasn't sure if she wanted to tell him, since this felt very personal, and she'd not even spoken about it with Tatsuki either. But then, Urayu knew already, didn't he? And he hadn't said anything. She was sure Chad wouldn't either. So, after a moment, she nodded and explained. "Yeah, I wanted to tell him how much I like him. Urayu said that, if you love somebody, you should tell them, even if you're afraid about how they'll react. It's about being honest, both with them and yourself, and he said to keep a secret like that would be bad. Also that Ichigo would never figure it out on his own, but I think that's just Urayu being himself. Sometimes he's not too good to see the positive facets of things and people, I think." Orium giggled a bit at that. It was funny, that Urayu could be so smart and yet miss the things that shone most brightly sometimes. Maybe it was because of the glasses, the refraction of light in them keeping him from noticing. But even with that, Orium thought he was right. Telling the truth, after all, was never wrong. "So, you know, I thought telling him when he was in a good mood after training would be best, right?" However, as she considered how such a scene might go in her head, Orium realized something else, which caused her to pout a bit as she considered the new idea. "But I'm not so sure I should do it now, anymore. I mean, when Ichigo is feeling so down, it doesn't seem fair to him, to give him something else so big to think about, does it? It feels like I'd be putting my own feeling before his own. If he's feeling down, I should take care of that, help him feel better and recover, before I talk about how I feel, right? That's what a true friend would do, I think, put their friend's well-being first, and themselves second." Orium wasn't sure. It felt like the right idea, and she generally had never had any real problems simply following her feelings, but it contrasted with Urayu's suggestion, and that had felt right as well. It was a real conundrum. Chad, at least, seemed to be considering the matter seriously. He had a thoughtful expression, and Orium knew he would come up with a good idea when he was done thinking. It was easy to tell, since Chad always had a thoughtful expression and always came up with good ideas. Orium was pretty sure he was always thinking about everything, which made her happy to have a friend that smart. And in fact, after a moment, when Chad spoke, he had the thoughtful tone that indicated he was going to help her figure things on her own, so she listened carefully. So, you feel like you should tell Ichigo the truth, and also like you shouldn't, because of putting his well-being first, right? Orium nodded happily at that, glad that he'd figured out her problem so quickly. Yes, it's difficult because normally I'd follow my feeling, but now I feel like both ideas are the right one to follow, and they don't work together at all. She huffed at that, puffing her cheeks. She knew from her stories that love was complicated, but she wouldn't have thought it would be this complicated. Maybe she needed to read more romances, rather than her preference for adventure stories with romances in them. It seemed like they'd be less thrilling, but maybe going into more details would help her figure out how to deal with this kind of problems better. Then Chad spoke, and she pushed the thought aside to hear what he had to say. I think that both of your instincts are correct, and you should put his feelings first, and also tell him. That left Orium genuinely puzzled. But, those two things can't go together, right? Chad shook his head. Think of it like this. You should definitely put his emotional well-being first, but you need to also consider the consequences. Helping him feel better if he's down is right, it's what any friend would want to do, you should definitely respect his feelings. However, say that you have success, and help him feel better, and then, once he does, you tell him you love him. Don't you think he might feel like he owed you something, since you helped him feel better when he was down? Would he even be able to tell you an honest no without feeling bad for having taken advantage of your emotional help? Orium's eyes widened in surprise at that. I hadn't thought about that at all. Chad nodded. I know you wouldn't have, it isn't in your nature, but it's something to think about. Furthermore, what if he suspected that you had done it intentionally? Been there, showing support and offering comfort, only because you wanted him to feel indebted and accept your declaration later on. She placed her fists on her hips at that, glaring. I would never do that. That's just, so dishonest. You're not a real friend if you only help somebody because you want them to stay with you because of guilt. A real friend would help because they care about you. That's the whole point of being friends. Chad raised his hands in a gesture of surrender as he nodded. It is, you are right. To pretend to be a friend and act like one while expecting something in return other than friendship isn't right. And you wouldn't do that. But if you keep your affection secret, and only revealed it after you'd helped him out of his bad mood, it might come across as if you were doing something like that, you see. Orium frowned, and she could feel the sadness overcoming her as she thought it over. Chad was right, wasn't he? Even if she didn't mean it that way, it wouldn't be fair to Ichigo to put him in a situation where he had to feel like that, either guilty or fearful that Orium had only been his friend to trick him into becoming her boyfriend. It wasn't right, but then. Orium floundered. So, what should I do then? I want Ichigo to know, and I want to help him out of his bad mood, and I don't want him to think I'm trying to make him feel guilty. What's the right thing to do? I think you should still tell him first, but then ask him not to answer you yet. Make it clear that you know he's not in a good headspace right now, and that you don't want to put pressure on him. That you'll stay his friend and help him regardless of what he says or how long he takes to decide, but that you didn't feel it would be honest of you to simply help him out without explaining your own feelings first, because you didn't want him to feel like he owed you anything in return for your friendship. Wouldn't that put some pressure on him though, to want to answer immediately, or still make him feel guilty anyway if he didn't like me the same way I like him? Orium didn't think Chad was wrong, at least not fully. If nothing else, this would allow her to follow both of her feelings, helping Ichigo, and being honest with him at the same time. But it also felt like this could become a really big mess. Which wasn't new to her, she made big messes very often, especially whenever she was trying something new, but making a mess out of her and Ichigo's feelings was something she really wouldn't want to. Chad seemed to consider her words carefully, as he usually did, and then answered. I think there's a risk of it, yes, but I still believe it would be better than the alternative. It's probably a more difficult path to walk, but I think if you can walk it, you and Ichigo both will be better at the end of it, whereas I don't think you would be if you took the path of not telling him until he's feeling better. Orium pouted, because she still didn't really like it, but she could see that Chad had a valid point, so she answered, a bit tired. I guess I'll just try and see? It just seems like it's going to be a very difficult discussion to have. And I'm not that good at speaking, I don't think. Chad smiled in an encouraging manner. I think differently, and am sure you'll do fine. Then he assumed a thoughtful expression, adding, although you might want to do something to build up your confidence and put yourself in a good mood before you speak with Ichigo, so that your honesty can come through in your words. Orium thought of something that could put her in a good mood, and a sudden idea came to her as she said, happily. I know just what'd do it. It's been a while since we, Ichigo, Tatsuki and I, went on a proper shopping spree. I could ask them to come along with me at one, and that always put me in a great mood. Then I can tell him afterwards, so he can think it all over, right? Are you sure that wouldn't be the same as putting him in a good mood to get him to agree? Orium could hear the tone of warning in Chad's voice, but she shook her head quickly. She knew Ichigo, and that wasn't how he'd react to that. No, see, he always comes along because we need somebody to carry our bags, but he's always a bit annoyed and exasperated at the end, which is a better mood than he's in now, yes, but he'd know I'd done it for me, and not for him. So, it should work, right? Chad smiled, apparently a bit surprised, although it was possible that was just because Orium had been waving her hands a bit, and Chad wasn't a person that gesticulated much at all. If you feel sure about it, I trust your judgment. Thanks. You're a good friend, Chad, I think I really needed the help. The tall boy shrugged, to indicate it was no big deal. Friends are supposed to protect each other, and protecting your feelings also count. It was still very nice of you. I'm happy to hear it then. I hope that helped you feel better about not having the chance to train with Ichigo then. Orium rocked herself on her heel a bit at that. Some. But I still think I need to train. Nanao said I need to keep up constant practice if I want to build up a connection to the Zanpakuto, and I also want to grow stronger. She closed her fist, glaring at the sky where she guessed Mr. Aizen was hiding somewhere, being a smug lying liar. When the bad guys come, I want to do better than I did last time. That, too, is a part of being a better friend to Ichigo and Tatsuki and you and Urayu and Rukia and Momo and Nimue and Nanao and Renji and Mr. Yukatake and Mr. Komamura and Mr. Shunsui and everybody else. She nodded to herself. She was not going to let her friends be hurt if she could help. Plus, she had a lot of new ideas she wanted to try out. When she'd been helping Ms. Anohana with healing, the older woman had expressed a lot of interest in her abilities, and suggested a lot of interesting ways Orium could use her power more effectively both when healing and in a fight. The woman was one of the most kind and friendly people Orium had ever met, even if a lot of people somehow seemed afraid of her for no reason Orium had been able to detect. As far as she could tell, Ms. Anohana was really just very nice to everybody, and knew a lot of things. Orium was sure she could become just like her if she just worked at it, which was why she had decided she would train her powers as much as she could. Chad seemed to have been thinking something along similar lines, as he asked, with a smile. Do you want to come train with me then? I too would like to improve the effectiveness of my abilities after what I learned about my limits in Soul Society, and perhaps we could help each other, since we have such similar powers. Of course. That'd be fun, and thanks again for all your help, Chad. No need for thanks, that's what friends are for. Orium grinned, following along, even as in her head she started to plan the shopping trip she was going to drag Ichigo and Tatsuki on in the morrow. Now that she knew what she had to do, she couldn't wait to get to it. Everything would work perfectly, she just knew it. When she arrived at the meeting place, Tatsuki found that her master was sitting on a box while playing with her sword, the Zanpakuto's blade spinning between Hiyori's fingers, even as she flung into the air a crumpled piece of paper in her other hand, catching it as it fell and then throwing it into the air again. And the look in her brown eyes was almost entirely pure, distilled annoyance. You know, a different teacher might have gotten offended at being left with only a one-sentence note to explain a week-long absence. Explain to me why I shouldn't just drop you as a student right now. Tatsuki let out a long breath, gathering her energy, then answered, her voice and expression as serious as she could make them. It was an emergency. If I hadn't gone, a friend would have died. I couldn't stay. Hiyori didn't seem impressed at all by that. Was it? What sort of emergency was it, that it took a week to solve it? What, was your friend in another country, and yet somehow you still managed to get there in time, but she was being held in Soul Society? That, finally, caused Hiyori to stop, surprise clear on her face, so Tatsuki barreled forward before the other woman could recover, hoping the pause would last long enough for her to explain everything. I and my friends faced off against the Godai to get our friend back, nearly every one of us almost died, and we still only barely managed to save her in time. You don't say. Hiyori looked genuinely intrigued now. And did you face off against anybody from the 11th? My friends beat Ikeku and Yumichika, and I had a fight with Yachiru and one with your captain. Hiyori whistled at that last one, and asked, sounding almost eager. All right, that sounds amazing, I'll give you that. I bet he gave you a beating, How did you manage to get him to spare you? I told him I could give him the chance to fight somebody even stronger, who he'd wanted to fight for a while. Hiyori slapped her knee in amusement at that. Ah. That would do it. Also, he didn't give me that much of a beating, until my hollow started to disobey. I think I was doing fine. Hiyori scoffed. Yeah, right. Don't get me wrong, I believe your prisoner screwed up the fight, but if you think you had a chance against the captain, that just means he wasn't fighting you as hard as he could have. Tatsuki let out a long breath, shaking her head. It wasn't like it had ever been likely for her to persuade Hiyori of that, in any case. Kenpeicha was scary enough that it made sense for people not to believe she could have put up a good fight against him, even if Tatsuki didn't think she'd done that badly. Meanwhile, Hiyori seemed to be stretching, getting ready for some more training as she commented. So, you're on the run from Soul Society too now, Welcome to the club, I guess. Do you want me to introduce you to the others? I think they might like having a new face around. The occasion was too good for Tatsuki to pass it up, so she answered quickly. I would love to, but not for the reasons you think. What do you mean? I mean that, as a result of our actions, Aizen had to expose himself, and now Soul Society knows that he sealed the hollows inside of you against your will. You're all being pardoned, and can go back home now, if you want to. Hiyori stared at her for a long moment, then her eyes narrowed and she said, annoyance back on her face in full force. That's bullshit. No way would they let us roam freely through Soul Society with an hollow in our bellies. After meeting me, they now know that Vizard are capable of keeping their inner hollows in check. There's no reason they would need to keep you caged or fear you anymore. Hiyori scoffed, crossing her arms. Yeah, right, you tell yourself that. I think they're trying to use you to get to us, and once they have us all in one place, Old Man Genocide is gonna put us all, including you, in a nice little cage that he can fill with fire to get rid of us all at once whenever he wants. You have no idea what that man would to get rid of something if he thought it might be a threat to his precious Soul Society. Tatsuki grimaced at that. She had expected that this wouldn't be easy. Still, she mustered her determination and went on. He can't do that, because he's going to need our help, both that of me and my friends, and that of your group, to fight Aizen. That caused Hiyori to went very still. Are you saying that he revealed himself as the traitor he is, and yet somehow still managed to get away? Tatsuki grimaced, then nodded. Yeah, we tried to stop him, but we weren't strong enough to stop him, Jin and Tuan together. I'm sorry. Hiyori made a waving motion with her hand, dismissing the matter with a scoffing please, this isn't your fault. You're strong, but not so strong you could stop 3 captains from doing whatever the hell they wanted to. Yamamoto was supposed to stop them, this is his fault and no one else's. Tatsuki wasn't sure that she agreed. After all, Ichigo had taken down a captain on his own, while the rest of them had been able to take down another. If they'd just managed to hold off until Anohana had showed up, Tatsuki was willing to bet they would have been able to stop Aizen from running. Still, there was no point in crying about that. She'd learned that lesson well enough. Losing a battle wasn't the end of the game, so long as you were able to get back into it and learn from that loss. With that thought clear in her mind, Tatsuki looked at Hiyori and said, in a firm tone. Regardless, he's out there now, and has the Hujioku and an army of hollows with him. Hiyori didn't look shocked at all. If anything, she looked resigned. Yeah, of course he does. Shinji said that those hollows who have been harrying us all over the place, the King Panther and the Grand Fisher and the multi-armed Mantis, they were all working for him the whole time. And I imagine he wouldn't have revealed himself if he hadn't gotten the Hujioku back. We'll need to be careful now, or he could use that thing to make puppets out of us all. Tatsuki seized her chance to answer to that, in a hurried tone. Which is why you need to persuade your friends to work with us and Soul Society to take him down. He's too big of a threat for you to handle him on your own. But Hiyori shook her head, and it was clear to Tatsuki that she was disagreeing even before she confirmed it. He's a bigger bother than ever before, to be sure, but that's not something unexpected. We've been worried about something like this for a long time, and more so since he took Shinji prisoner. We've made preparations, and if Aizen comes for us or send his lackeys to hunt us down, we'll be ready, and even have a few surprises he might not be expecting. Tatsuki frowned at that. She'd been hoping that would have worked. You would risk having to face him without any help. Better than risking to put ourselves in the hands of people who were ready to kill us without mercy or trial just because of fear. Having their power at my back won't make it easier to fight, it just caused me to keep having to watch my back rather than focus on the enemies in front of me. Seeing as she was getting nowhere with rational arguments, Tatsuki decided it was time to try and follow her friend's suggestions, so she asked, in an annoyed tone. I can't believe there's nobody in all of Soul Society you wouldn't trust. What if I asked somebody from the 11th to show up? Surely you can name a few of them you could trust to just want to talk, at least. Or I could ask for somebody from the 3rd, if the rest of your team has friend they'd be willing to talk with in there. Hiyori frowned, but at least she seemed to consider the matter for a moment, before eventually answering, in a doubtful tone. Might be that'd be doable, but I don't trust the Omnitsukido to let things go that smoothly. I bet that tricky lot would be able to come up with impersonators or something else to fool us with. Oh, come on. Are you really so scared, that you wouldn't even dare brave such a little risk? I didn't thought you'd be this much of a coward. That caused a spark of anger to appear in Hiyori's eyes as she pointed her sword at her and said, in a low, almost hissing tone. Careful there, little girl, I've gutted people for lesser insults than that. I'm not scared of anything, and you better remember it. Tatsuki crossed her arms, completely undeterred by the death threat. It wasn't like Hiyori didn't throw out a couple during every training session, and she'd never followed up on any of them. So she replied, in a firm tone. Might be hard to remember, if you don't act like it. Hiyori frowned for a moment, then sheathed her sword and said, her tone the same. Fine. I'll talk with the others, see what they think, and maybe we'll set up a meeting. Or maybe not. I'm putting our meetings on pause until I have a decision. I'll leave you a message at the usual place once I have a decision. And if we decide for a meeting, we'll be setting the conditions. Make that clear to the Godai in advance. I'm not doing any of that pointless negotiating they're so fond of. We either run things my way or not at all. Tatsuki nodded, then hesitate for a moment, which caused Hiyori to snap a what at her in a tone that made it clear she wasn't going to tolerate any further attempts at persuasion. Tatsuki took a long breath, then said, her voice taking a pleading tone. I want you to know, I only want to make sure you all are safe. I don't want Aizen to take you out because you didn't have backup. That's all. Hiyori scoffed. That's not gonna happen, we've kept ahead of him for a century, we're not about to slip now. Then, the short blonde simply turned and left, and Tatsuki did the same, anxiety building in her as she did. She'd tried her best, yet she wasn't sure if that'd be enough to bring the Vizard around, and despite how sure of herself Hiyori seemed, Tatsuki didn't feel reassured. She knew enough about being overconfident, and she couldn't help but worry that her master was falling in the same trap Tatsuki herself had fallen afoul of so many times. And unlike the Vizard or Shinigami had done for her, if they did actually act recklessly, Tatsuki didn't think Aizen would be gracious enough to heal Hiyori's team afterwards. Chapter 69, Fun. As they headed to Urahara's small antiquity shop, which the Shinigami had decided would be their headquarters on account of already having the setup for a gate to the afterlife in place, Tatsuki still wasn't confident that things would work themselves out. She had at least a bit of hope, which was better than none at all, but it was a shaky one, and she still would have preferred it had Hiyori been more open. It didn't felt like she'd completely failed, but it felt like getting fourth in a competition that she was sure she had the skills to win, disappointing and somewhat frustrating, as if she had fallen short of an achievable goal. It didn't help matters that only Orium and Ichigo were with her. Ishida, when they had contacted them, had been very firm that he'd rather not stomach the company of Shinigami until Rukia herself was back, while Chad had said he would try to speak with the Fullbringer, see if there was any chance of getting some cooperation from them. Tatsuki didn't think it very likely, and Ichigo had agreed with her on the matter, especially when they'd kept them imprisoned for a week and it was likely several of them might have left Karakura entirely, but Orium had been hopeful, and they'd all collectively agreed it was at least worth trying, and that Chad was the person best suited to do it. If nothing else, they knew if they had to watch their back from Jinjo's old group or not, and in the best possible scenario, they might have some extra allies when Aizen's hollow army showed up. Despite knowing it was the reasonable thing, Tatsuki still wasn't very happy about it. She trusted Orium and Ichigo absolutely, and knew they were both pretty strong, but there was no denying that, after their fight with the Lightning Shinigami, having Chad's massive presence at her back was reassuring. Especially when, even as they professed to now be genuine allies, Tatsuki could not easily forget that she'd been fighting Soul Society just a few days ago, nor all the things that Kyokaku had told her about the way they ran their society. She'd managed to put the one-armed woman in contact with Yoriuki and Rukia, which hopefully would help, but she wasn't sure it was fair to put that burden fully on their friend's shoulders. Still, she would trust Rukia for now, the other girl had earned that much. "We're here." Orium's words shook Tatsuki out of her musings, and she looked at the building in front of them, commenting idly. "Is it even necessary? They don't need our help to set up, and I'm sure Urahara has some device to open the gate from the other side." Ichigo shrugged, even as Orium triumphantly pulled the key out of her purse and moved to open the shop's front door, and offered in a bored tone. "It'll make things smoother, and having us secure the door on this side so they can't be ambushed will give them some peace of mind. And being able to recognize the Shinigami that'll be working here on site is likely to come in handy. Plus, we promised. And Renji'll be sad if we don't greet him." Tatsuki sighed, and conceded the point as her orange-haired friends led the way inside. If nothing else, Rukia's friend had seemed fun. The redhead was more on her wavelength than most people she'd met in a while, and Ichigo said he'd given him a good fight, so he ought to be at least decent. Considering her training sessions with Hiyori were likely going to be cancelled for the foreseeable future, having another sparring partner was not a bad thing. As they reached the underground, Tatsuki watched the array of multiple computers connected to the empty frame of what she knew was the doorway to the afterlife, and she realized she had no idea how the thing actually worked. "So, anybody knows what we should do next?" Ichigo shrugged, saying, "No idea," but Orium grinned and said, as she headed for the closest machine. "I do. Mr. Kisuke and Nemu explained it all to me. It's not complicated at all, just think of it as a spaceship." Tatsuki chuckled, shaking her head as she told her friend. Those spaceships were very complicated." Orium shook her head, even as she waited for the 3 screens she'd turned on to finish powering up fully, and answered. "If children younger than us can run them, that means for a person our age it'd be easy, doesn't it?" As she had no idea which science fiction books and shows her friend was referring to, among the multitude she was a fan of, Tatsuki had no answer other than watching Orium opening a number of windows across the computers, referencing different stuff, and couldn't help but chuckle a bit at the concentrated expression on her face. Next to her, Ichigo noticed and commented, amused. "Sometimes, you kinda forget she'd the 3rd-ranked student in the whole school, don't you?" Tatsuki nodded, but then countered, for the fun of it. "Well, so long as the teachers aren't annoyed she did things her own way rather than follow instructions. Which, you know, she does more than half the time." That caused Ichigo to chuckle as well, before he nodded in Orium's direction as she shouted a satisfied "ah!" and started typing in a quick command in one of the 3 machines, and said, "You'd think that'd make math, geometry, and programming her worst subjects, rather than the best ones. Nah, since those are all about understanding the underlying concepts, I'm not surprised she does better there than in things where you need to write essays, since in those the fact you understand the concepts and can apply that knowledge isn't as important as making it look good." Then, Orium hit the enter key, and the portal started to glow to life, before opening on the scene of what would have looked like a bog-standard office with white floor, ceiling, and walls, if not for the 2 dozens or so armed Shinigami waiting on the other side, with a tall one at the front sporting big red hairs collected in a high ponytail. Renji grinned upon seeing them, saying, "Hey guys, nice to see you again," as he moved through the doorway, barely glancing around before nodding to confirm that no enemy was waiting in ambush. Once that was done, he waved for the others Shinigami to come in. Tatsuki took note that they looked somewhat more orderly than most of those she had personally met. It was hard to explain precisely why, as they were all wearing the normal Shinigami uniform, yet it seemed just that little bit more formal on them. After a moment, she shook her head as she refocused on Renji, who was asking in a relaxed tone. "So, how are things going? Are you all fine?" She took charge of speaking, letting out a long breath. "Good enough. I've spoken with the Vizard, but haven't gotten an answer back yet. They want to discuss the matter before they decide." Renji looked surprised, then shrugged. "Man, you work fast. If there's something I've learned from being in charge, is that getting other people to agree to any sort of cooperation is a pain, and that's just with other divisions. That you've gotten them to be thinking it over already is pretty good." Tatsuki felt strangely comforted by that. It wasn't a point of view she'd considered, and the possibility that her lack of success might have been considered a good result by an expert was nice. She offered a brief thank you, then looked at the machinery that some of the Shinigami were bringing in, coordinated by a young brown-haired woman with large glasses, and asked, "What's all that stuff?" Renji turned to follow Tatsuki's gaze, smiling as he said, "That's just stuff to keep contact with the Mortal Realms headquarters for the 6th. But it reminds me." Then he raised his voice as he shouted, "Shirogane, Dordoni, come here a moment," which caused the coordinator to half jump in surprise before turning and coming along, as did another Shinigami who, Tatsuki realized, had remained at the back of the group, as if to ensure nobody was left behind. He was taller than even Renji, and she noticed that he seemed older than most of the other Shinigami Renji had brought with himself, looking as if he were at least in his late 30s. He looked even more elegant than most of the rest, with a well-cared-for black Van Dyke beard and mustache, and most of his hairs so carefully coiffed that the 2 locks that stood up to the side of the white headband he was wearing looked almost like horn. He swaggered closer, while the mousy girl seemed almost hesitant as she approached, even as Renji placed a hand over her shoulder and introduced her first. "This here is the 6th Division's 9th-seeded OFFI sire, Mihane Shirogane, and the other one is Alessandro Dordoni, the 1st-seeded OFFI sire." Ichigo frowned in confusion at that, asking, "I thought each seated officer commanded about 250 people. Did you really need that many Shinigami just to watch Karakura?" Renji laughed, and shook his head, before explaining. "Oh, no, not at all. Most of those are still in the main Mortal Realm headquarters in Beijing, since coordinating the protection of the whole area under the protection of the 6th from here would be very difficult. We're only going to keep about 2 teams here. I just wanted at least a couple of our best fighters to have some firepower ready if we needed it. And Shirogane is the smartest person in the division, so I got her help handle the coordination and paperwork. She's much better at it than I am." The woman looked quite embarrassed at that, while the man puffed up his chest and said, in a declarative tone, "Of course. As it's just a matter of time before I match Renji boy and reclaim my post as lieutenant, it's only expected he would keep as powerful a Shinigami as myself at his side." Renji grimaced, which told Tatsuki that such declaration weren't unusual from the man. She could see Ichigo was thinking the same thing as he muttered, "We must make sure he and my father never met," in a half-joking, half-worried tone. Tatsuki found herself shuddering at the imagine that prompted, and nodded. Orium, meanwhile, seemed completely unaffected, as she waved with a big smile, introducing each of them by name before handing over a rolled-up piece of paper that seemed thick enough to bludgeon somebody with it. Renji blinked, frowning as he looked at it and then asking, "What's that?" to which Orium replied by explaining, "The rules for handling all of the equipment here, of course." Renji blinked again, then nodded slowly before handing it over to Shirogane, who took the paper with a long-suffering sigh. Orium didn't seem to care about the back and forth, however, as she clapped her hands and said, in an excited tone, "Right then, I'm really glad I got to meet you all, but we need to leave to go shopping." Renji looked confused, as did Ichigo, which Tatsuki took to mean Orium hadn't forewarned their friend, so she spoke up quickly. You haven't forgotten that we need to go to the dojo to practice first, right? Of course not, but then after we're going to go shopping, right? Ichigo, you'll come too, yes. Orium's smile was binding, and her pleading eyes were no less effective than usual. Tatsuki wasn't sure there were many people around who could say her no when she got like that. Ichigo certainly couldn't, as he sighed while scratching the back of his head and answering, yes, fine, we'll go, which caused Orium to do a fist pump and small hop, so Tatsuki hurried to add, in case her friend had forgotten, but only after we've gotten through some training first. You mind if I tag along? They all turned to Renji, who said with a grin, I'm curious to see what sort of training you two went through to become as strong as you are, and I won't be needed for setting things up, Shirogane could handle that on her own. He paused, then leaned forward and added in a conspiratorial tone, plus, it's incredibly boring. Tatsuki couldn't help but laugh a bit at that, before warning Renji, we won't be doing spiritual combat training, only martial arts. You won't really be able to participate in that as a ghost. Renji was surprised, then said, sounding intrigued. You know, I have never really had the chance to try and fighting in a Jigai? That might be interesting to try. You have a Jigai ready? Renji nodded. Yeah, Urahara apparently thought it was indispensable for each Shinigami I'll bringing along to have one or two. I think mine are, He trailed off, looking to the large number of man-sized boxes that the Shinigami were wheeling in, which caused Shirogane to point at one and said, there should be one there, Lieutenant Abarai, to which Renji nodded happily. He quickly entered the box, only to raise out of it wearing black slacks and a white shirt, to which he looked in a bit of surprise before saying with a grin. Well, this is going to be fun, right? Tatsuki couldn't help but chuckle, motioning for him to follow as they all left, and she said, amused at his apparently genuine interest. Sure, if you only mean to watch. If you want to actually fight, that'll be painful instead. He didn't seem dissuaded, which she hadn't expected him to. Tatsuki was looking forward to having a proper spar with somebody she'd never actually fought before, and as he answered with an excited "You're on," she couldn't help the threatening grin on her lips. Renji had to admit that being in a Jigai was a weird experience. He could still use his spiritual perception, but it was somewhat dulled, and his Ryutsu was mostly sealed into the Jigai. He could push it out with some effort, but it didn't respond as quickly as he was used to, and it was immediately dragged back inside the Jigai the moment he stopped concentrating on it. He was pretty sure that would make normal spiritual combat pretty difficult unless he ditched the thing and returned to soul form, which hopefully was going to make the sparring he was promised that much more interesting. As they used the changing rooms the dojo offered to get into clothes more well suited to exercise, with Renji himself having to borrow some of the extra one the place kept for people who didn't have their own, he asked Ichigo, just to make some conversation. So, who am I going to be trying out with first, you or Tatsuki? Ichigo looked perplexed for a moment, then answered in an apologetic tone. I don't think I'll be able to give you any time today. I'm training the beginner kendo class, and kids like those tend to take longer to get things right. Renji blinked, he hadn't expected that. The orange-haired boy didn't look the type of the wise teacher. If anything, he reminded Renji a lot of the delinquent gangs he himself had been a part of as a kid, in look at least. But then, Ichigo was a surprising person in many ways. After all, one wouldn't say he looked like the type to beat Captain Kukaki, and yet he had. Still, Renji couldn't help but ask, curious. So, you and Tatsuki teach here? I thought it was just a place for you to train. Ichigo shook his head. For Tatsuki, you'd be right. Renji was surprised at that. From the way interacted, he hadn't gotten the impression Ichigo was Tatsuki's teacher, or even an elder disciple. If anything, it seemed the opposite. You're the best of the two of you then. Ichigo seemed surprised at that, then chuckled. I don't think so, and don't let her hear you say something like that. She's reached the finals of National Martial Arts Competition 5 years in a row now. She's very good. I just prefer the slower tempo of teaching as it helps me perfect the details of my technique, while she put herself through relentless drills to push her stamina. It's just a matter of focus. She prefers the more physical side of fighting. I'm more about the technical aspects of it. Renji nodded, that made sense. Seeing that Ichigo had finished changing, he hurried up, which caused Ichigo to raise an eyebrow when he saw that Renji's torso was fully covered in tattoos from abdomen to neck, and asked after them. Renji grinned and explained, feeling a certain satisfaction. I got a new one for every new accomplishment, the last one I took for unlocking Bankai. He pointed to the markings over his eyebrows to clarify what he meant, which caused Ichigo to nod in understanding. Renji had picked up the habit back in his gang days, and since some of those gangsters had been purified souls who came from the mortal realm, Renji didn't doubt the practice was known enough to mortals as well, even though, being a soul formed directly in soul society, Renji couldn't say he had personal experience with it. The comment did brought up to mind his disappointment with himself for having failed to earn any new tattoos throughout the battles he'd fought against his fellow GODI members. He'd really hoped he was about to prove himself worthy of one during the assault at Sokioku Hill. His Bankai had let him take out almost an entire division by himself, and he had been putting Captain Odoribashi on the back foot, Zabumaru's skeletal whips fighting out the 5th Division Captain's golden one well enough he'd had hope of overpowering the man. Then, Captain Odoribashi had pulled out his own Bankai. Renji had heard it was some sort of tricky sound-based mind power, and was confident he could fight it out simply by keeping himself from hearing it. However, as it turned out, his plan hadn't been as infallible as he'd hoped for, because the other captain's power actually created puppet soldiers. Apparently, his sword didn't just release sounds to cause explosion, it actually recorded all sounds produced in a certain radius, and the sonic explosion Captain Odoribashi used to fight were just a manner of employing the Shikai's actual ability to reproduce those recorded sound. And with his Bankai, he created puppets that reproduced a few of those collected sounds, and, importantly, could take any actions that would produce such sound. In theory, that meant that each puppet only had a limited amount of things it could do, a pattern that could be learned and exploited. In practice, Renji had been prepared for something completely different, and overwhelmed before he could adjust. He wasn't particularly annoyed about it, after all. He's still managed to stall the entire division long enough for Tatsuki and her friends to free Rukia, and that was the important part. It was just a bit disappointing that he'd felt himself come so close to earning himself another badge of valor, only to have it snatched away at the last moment. Still, Renji refocused and got over the momentary mood swing. With how Captain Kukaki had just placed him in the middle of the action, he was confident he would get a chance to make a name for himself soon enough. For now, he would just focus on training and try to enjoy it. He paused, however, as he saw the class of trainees Ichigo was heading for. It was about a dozen, almost all of which seemed to be between 8 and 10 years old. The one exception was a busty young woman with orange hair and a disarming expression who was waving happily at them and shouting Ichigo. Over here. Amid the perplexed glances of the kids with her, Renji leaned closer toward Ichigo and asked, letting his confusion show. I thought Orium was as good as you and Tatsuki? She fought Nimue to a standstill and went up against the captain commander, right? Or did I understand that wrong? Next to him, Ichigo shook his head and answered no, you didn't. But that was mostly on the strength of her Fullbringer powers. She has no formal training of any sort. Or at least didn't. She's planning on changing that. Renji could see that, even if the tone of voice as Ichigo spoke was somewhat exasperated, he also looked quite fond, as if the girl's antics were not just something he expected, but was almost happy about. Renji patted him on the shoulder and said, in an encouraging tone. All right then, if you tell me where I can find Tatsuki, I'll let you go have your fun. Ichigo pointed, and Renji moved to the other room, only to stop in his track as he found that Tatsuki had apparently arrived before they did, and already in the middle of a sparring. In fact, if the two people sitting on the sidelines who looked like they were recovering breath and glared at the girl with clear disdain was anything to go by, she'd already won too, and her opponent on the mat was being pressed into putting up a desperate defense that Renji didn't think would last much longer. He moved closer to the edge of the sparring area to get a better view of the combat, and as he watched, he found himself surprised in seeing that Tatsuki wasn't using any of her Ryutsu at all. Even if it was difficult to access it when she wasn't in pure soul form, Renji had little doubt that she could, but it seemed like she was willingly limiting herself only to the things her mortal physique was capable of. He wondered if she was holding back because of some self-imposed challenge, or if she was going easy on her opponents. After all, even with how little he could access his own and how unfamiliar he was with the Jigei's limitation, Renji would be willing to bet what he could use would be enough to mop the floor with any purely mortal fighter. When Tatsuki sent her opponent to the ground and the tall boy surrendered, she huffed, and he could clearly see that, unlike her sparring partner, she wasn't even winded. She looked around, clearly seeking a new opponent, and her eyes lighted up as they focused on him, so Renji grinned and said, in a polite tone, "May I have the next bout?" "Renji, I was wondering what was taking you so long. Come on, let's see what you're capable of." He nodded, moving in front of her, then said, in a friendly tone, "I do hope you won't be too embarrassed if I happen to win this one." Tatsuki's grin grew a bit threatening at that, as she smashed her fists together and moved to a guard position while saying, in a confident tone, "You sure you won't feel too humiliated when I take you down in the first exchange?" He let his grin gain the same challenging tint hers had, and answered with absolute confidence, "If I don't lose, there won't be any reason for me to feel bad, will it?" That seemed to be enough banter for Tatsuki, as she immediately launched her first attack, darting forward while aiming a straight punch at Renji's head. He ducked backwards and out of the way, only to realize Tatsuki was using her momentum to swing her leg in a kick from the right side, aimed directly at his midsection. He swung his elbow in a straight block, but the touch was much lighter than he'd expected, because, Renji realized after a moment, she hadn't truly committed, and instead used the leverage point his block offered to pivot while swinging for her head in a much faster backhand smack. Renji pushed just the barest bit of repulsively charged Ryatsu from his head, giving his dodge downward just enough speed to avoid Tatsuki's attack, even as he felt it grazing the top of his ponytail. He didn't let that scare him, instead countering with a swiping motion of his hooked leg. Tatsuki immediately dodged by hopping backwards, so he let all out as much Ryatsu as he could, still a very tiny amount, barely enough to have any effect, hardened with determination from the bottom of his foot, causing the mat to vibrate very barely, and Tatsuki's landing to stumble. It was a minimal thing, which he'd not even have noticed if he hadn't been the one to cause it, but it was enough to put Tatsuki somewhat on the back foot, so he charged forward, once again letting a bit of Ryatsu flow out of his heel to give his lunge just enough extra propulsion that, combined with her slightly off balance, forced Tatsuki to go into a hard block with crossed arms, rather than deflecting as would have been better. He followed up with a lightly Ryatsu-enhanced knee to the abdomen, or at least that was the plan, but Tatsuki surprised him by leaning to her left, his right, while letting her other feet slid backwards, so the attack went wide. Renji grinned as he realized Tatsuki was now in a position where she could easily turn the block into a point of pressure to launch her attack, as he would need to disengage first and that would give her an opening. Not that he was worried, whichever direction she decided to attack from, Renji still had a free hand to counter with. Still, it was the perfect position for her to try and reverse the momentum of the battle from. Tatsuki, however, didn't press the attack. Instead, she frowned, leaning toward him so that they stood so close to each other that none of the observers could precisely follow the movements of their lips, and said, in an accusing whisper, "That's cheating." Renji raised an eyebrow at that, and countered, "Just because you're losing, there's no need to take it that badly." Her frown grew more annoyed as she said, "I can use my Ryatsu too, but the point of training here is to focus on my reflexes and form. Using Ryatsu would defeat the whole point. You sure you aren't just pretending to be taking it easy on me because it'll give you an excuse to justify your loss?" A spark of annoyance entered Tatsuki's eyes at that, but then it disappeared, replaced by a grin that brought back memories of Renji's time training in the 11th under Kenpei, as she said in a low tone, "Remember, you asked for it." With that, she darted back. Renji hadn't expected that, and while it did mean Tatsuki had relinquished her good position, it also unbalanced him a bit as he lost the pressure on his fist that her block had been providing. Still, he was on the attack fast enough, kicking for her head, once again using a bit of Ryatsu to give his attack a bit more speed, except this time, rather than try to block, Tatsuki dove to the ground, letting the attack pass over her head, and then spun, using her hands as support to swipe with both legs, her movement smoothed out by a thin film of Ryatsu on her feet that made the movement too fast for Renji to avoid. The attack took his legs out from under him, but he covered his hand with just enough Ryatsu to make it stick to the ground as he used it to turn the fall into a quick crouch. It still gave Tatsuki the time to get back to a standing position and kick at him, forcing him to use his other forearm to block the attack, leaving Tatsuki free to aim a straight punch at his head. He dodged backwards with a bit of Ryutsu, but this time Tatsuki used Ryutsu herself, except she released some from the elbow to give her punch a sudden acceleration while at the same time pushing just a bit of repulsively charged from her knuckles, so that even if her first didn't hit his face, her Ryutsu did, sending him stumbling backwards. Before he could even regain his balance, Tatsuki was on him again, and he only barely managed to raise his forearm into another block, except this time, Tatsuki added the slightest bit of Ryutsu to the kick to send him stumbling to the side, keeping his attempt to grab the leg and throw her to the ground from succeeding. He raised an hand when he realized she was about to continue like that. She would hammer at him and keep up the pressure until he collapsed, leaving him to room to counter-attack, and said, amusement in his voice even as he needed to collect some breath. "All right, you've made your point. No Ryutsu, I promise." She seemed surprised at that, enough to stop her assault at least, then grinned with a certain sense of superiority on her face and shot back. "You think you have any chance at winning if you need to hold back?" He chuckled, getting into a guard position as he answered with a grin just as challenging as before. "Who knows, I might just surprise you. I learn quickly, and half the fun is in the challenge, isn't it?" Tatsuki grinned back, and then they were fighting again, this time with neither of them accessing their Ryutsu. The slower speed they had to move at made predicting each other's move easier, adding a cerebral challenge to the combat that kept it fun, and in forcing himself to keep his Ryutsu in check throughout, he found that the control got easier as he went, which, probably, would translate into better control when he was actually using it in the future as well. They had 3 spars in total, all of which Tatsuki ended up winning, but Renji wasn't bothered by that. He enjoyed the experience overall, and from the way the girl was laughing by the end, she had as well, which meant the spar had been a success. Of course, the compliments and mix of awe and envy from the onlookers had been welcome as well. Apparently, even without using Ryutsu, his level of skill was beyond most of these others, which buoyed his spirits somewhat. Overall, Renji decided, it seemed like something that would make for a good addition to his additional training routine, and when he asked Tatsuki if she was up for doing it more often, the girl was happy enough to agree. Renji couldn't help himself but grin in satisfaction at that. His captain trusted him enough to give him an important task. Fights that might be worth bragging about might be in his future, and he'd just found an interesting new way to get stronger and an excelled sparring partner. Things couldn't be going any better. After their time at the dojo was over, Ichigo wasn't surprised to find that Renji and Tatsuki were in a deep discussion about their spars, commenting on their respective mistakes and how they could get better. He was somewhat surprised when, once Orium had dragged them to her favorite mall, it turned out that Renji was almost as much into window shopping and clothes as Orium herself. He seemed to be particularly knowledgeable about clothing, from the way he and Orium were going back and forth over it. When Ichigo mentioned this, Renji nodded, as if it was the most obvious thing. "Of course I know about threads and cloths. I'm in charge of ensuring that the uniforms of the division meet Captain Kukaki's specifications, so I do a lot of checking and comparing various clothing as part of my work." Ichigo blinked in surprise at that. He could see it. Byakuya was definitely the type to be annoyingly precise about matters such as dress code, but Renji definitely didn't seem the type who'd enjoy doing that kind of job. "And you like it?" The redhead nodded enthusiastically. "Of course. We want a type of threading that breathes well, is durable and hold up to normal wear and tear, while still maintaining a clean appearance. It makes us look more professional, which is good for morale, you know." Tatsuki seemed to have a revelation then, judging from the expression on her face, as she asked, sounding curious. "Is that why the Shinigami of your division looked different from the others I've met, even if they were wearing the very same uniform?" Renji nodded, looking quite pleased that Tatsuki had noticed. "Yes. It's one of those things that people don't pay attention to, but can affect them unconsciously, predispose them to act in a certain way toward you." Ichigo nodded. He could see the point, although he personally didn't understand why anybody would go to such extents, or care so much, about what was in the end more appearances than substance. Trying to sound neutral, he commented, "I guess I never thought that to be that important." "Of course it is. You can't be cool if you don't look the part, and looking properly awesome takes effort, you know." Renji grinned at that, causing Tatsuki to chuckle at it, while Orium nodded enthusiastically and said, grabbing Ichigo's arm, That's right. See, Ichigo, that's why we need to get you new clothes. And then, before he could argue, Orium was dragging him away, while Tatsuki followed Renji as he headed for a sunglasses stand, mentioning he had a collection of them at home. Then, Ichigo was pushed into trying out a number of clothes. He did, although after the 10th colorful jacket she'd given him to try he asked, perplexed. What's even the point of trying out this many things? You know I'll only be able to afford 2 at most, and most of these are out of either of our price range. Orium puffed her cheeks at that. The point isn't to buy many, it's to have fun imagining what having them would be like. That's the whole point. Ichigo shrugged and complied, commenting in a relaxed tone. I suppose I just don't get it, but that's fine. He smiled at his friend. So long as you're having fun, I can let you have it. Then he glanced at the rest of the clothes Orium had collected for him to wear, asking, so, what should I try next? However, an answer was not quickly forthcoming. It was unusual enough, for Orium to be silent, that Ichigo turned, to check if his words had offended her, but instead he found that she looked thoughtful. He wanted to ask if everything was alright, but he knew his friend well enough by now to let her reach the end of whatever new idea had grabbed her attention, leaning on the door of the changing room. As he waited, he couldn't help but acknowledge to himself that, if nothing else, Orium's choices in clothing, much as he didn't understand them, were good. The jacket he was wearing now was much more comfortable than what he'd normally wear. It took only a minute for Orium to refocus her attention to him, and he was surprised to find strong determination in her eyes. Then she said, getting up. Ichigo, there is something I wanted to talk you about. That, to Ichigo ears, sounded worrisome. Have I done something that upset you? Her eyes widened in mixed surprise and confusion at that. What? No, why do you think that? Ichigo shrugged back. You just made that sound like it's something I'm not gonna like. I don't know if you'll like it, but I hope you will. It's really important to me. Ichigo wasn't sure what Orium might be so worried about, but he nodded as reassuringly as he could. I can promise I'll listen with an open mind. That seemed to relax Orium some, even as she was twisting her fingers together. I know you would. Because that's what friends do, right? We help each other, and listen, even when something isn't to our liking. She smiled, motioning to the clothes. Like modeling clothes we'll never wear just because a friend asked us to. Of course. Right. So I want you to understand, that I too would do a lot for you, even if I didn't like it, just because you knew you needed it. And I know you've not been feeling well after everything that happened with Rukia and Mr. Aizen, and I want you to know that I'll help you feel better, no matter what. Ichigo couldn't help but feel a bit of shame, at the idea that Orium of all people had noticed how bad he had been feeling about his lack of contribution to saving Rukia. He was not sure what the point was of bringing it up, but he could see the clear honesty in Orium's eyes, so he answered softly. I believe you, Orium, there's no need to speak of it. But she shook her head and answered. No, there is. It's important that you know I will help you, even if you do things wrong, or say things that you think might hurt me. No matter what, I'll be at your side. But, I also need to tell you something else, because I don't want you to feel indebted to me, if I tell you later. She looked straight into his eyes, and then said, very clear. I love you. Ichigo was left stunned by that. He wasn't sure what to think. It certainly wasn't something that he had ever considered, nor how he should answer. Was there even a right answer? Before he could figure that out, however, Orium got up and leaned forward, placing a finger on his lips to keep him from talking, and went on. And you don't need to answer now. In fact, I want you to just think about it, and not give me any answer at all, until you're ready, whenever that might be. I needed you to know it, and also to know that, even if you don't feel the same, I'll stay at your side anyway, because I'm your friend regardless. She waited a moment longer, before finally stepping back. Ichigo was left unable to answer. He didn't pay much attention to the rest of the shopping trip, although he did notice that Orium was acting like her normal self afterwards, enough so that he had to wonder if his memory was playing tricks with him. But on the other hand, he supposed that it made sense, She'd sounded very sincere when she'd said he shouldn't expect her attitude toward him to change. Eventually, the shopping trip ended, and Ichigo headed home, Orium's words echoing in his mind, and for the first time in a long while, he felt very confused over what should do next. He could only hope that a few days of peace would be enough to let him clear his mind and understand things, because, at the speed and with the chaos it had been going through, he was starting to feel like his life was a puzzle for which he was missing half the pieces. Chapter 70, Sharing. Ichigo's mind hadn't settled into a clear course of action by the time of his planned Zanjutsu training session with Orium. He'd considered rescheduling so he could figure out how he truly felt about her declaration, but in the end, he couldn't see any way in which it'd have been fair. After all, Orium was honestly, fully committed to continuing to interact with him the same way she had before, which meant she'd accept it but feel bad if he denied her the chance for training because of his own issues. And he might still enjoy the training. After all, it usually helped him to relax, and while he wasn't in the mood for it now, he was hopeful that would change once he got into it. Additionally, it was a rare enough thing for Orium to be this invested into training herself, and denying her might kill that enthusiasm, which Ichigo didn't want to do. With Aizen looming on the horizon, helping her get better at fighting was something that could save her life. Could he really call himself a decent person if he denied her the help she needed, and she got hurt because of it? He had, of course, considered the possibility that Orium's increased interest might just be a result of wanting to spend time with him, but in the end, he'd decided that was not the case, and this was the one thing he currently felt sure of. Not only would it be dishonest in a way Orium was not, but in the past, whenever she'd wanted to spend time with him, Orium had simply asked for it. To rely on this kind of subterfuge, especially immediately after her declaration and with her stated intent of not hiding her interest to him, didn't seem like something the girl he knew her to be would do. Despite having reached that decision, the first few minutes of training he spent mostly in a bit of awkward silence. A part of it was that they were training at Orium's house, and the fact she lived alone there suddenly felt relevant in a way it had never before been for Ichigo. Another was that, as he checked her form, he noticed her curves and long limbs with a greater level of awareness than he'd ever had before, and importantly, a very different type of awareness from when he evaluated a training partner, or an opponent in a fight. It was distracting and left him unsure how to correct her form to be more efficient without sending wrong signals about things he was not sure about at all, despite the fact he'd done this many times before and never felt like this. The feeling was strange, and at least a bit annoying. Luckily, Orium seemed oblivious to Ichigo's sense of weirdness, being her usual overexcited self, and that helped. It didn't took very long for Ichigo to push the sensation at the back of his mind, paying no attention to it, and regain his usual confidence, quickly finishing his evaluation of Orium's base level so they could move to actual spiritual training. Overall, he couldn't deny that she wasn't very good compared to most people Ichigo had crossed swords with, the years of practice and training just weren't there. However, between her actual combat experience and the stuff she'd picked up unconsciously through the years merely by being friend with him and Tatsuki and often spectating their training, Ichigo was confident enough he could hammer out the defects in her form with the traditional kendo lessons she was now taking at the dojo, and focus these private sessions entirely on working on her skill in spiritual combat, which was the whole point of them. When he said that, Orium looked even happier than usual and commented, almost gushing. "That's wonderful. Training in using the sword with our powers rather than just learning how to use any sword is going to really impress the Zanpakuto, isn't it?" That caused Ichigo pause, as it was not what he'd been expecting. "Orium, have you decided to train in swordsmanship just because you want to befriend your sword?" "Of course." She nodded emphatically, then went on to explain, "Nanao said that the best way to forge a connection with a Zanpakuto is to do sword things with it, show it I want to really learn how to treat a sword right. And other than fighting, learning how to use it properly is the only way to do that." Ichigo didn't really have a counter-argument to offer, so he limited himself to nod along. On one hand, it was so very much an Orium thing to do, to just dive straight into something she'd never cared about before just because it might let her make a new friend. On the other hand, it was reassuring, while Ichigo hadn't been sure whether she would be able to stick to the training if he made things too difficult. The knowledge of why she was trying to do it made him more sure that she wouldn't just let the matter go easily just because things got hard. It meant he could push and really try to see what her limits were without fear, which would be helpful in making the training help him get better as well, not just her. With this new conviction, Ichigo motioned for Orium's Zanpakuto and asked, trying to see what level they would be starting from. So, have you developed any tricks for spiritual combat with it already? I have. But I need a bit of help for it, Shunshunrika, come on, let's show Ichigo what we're capable of. As soon as she said that, the 6 fairies appeared, and 2 of them immediately moved to the sword, one taking place at the base and the other right at the tip, creating a line of golden light between each other that was laid just along the blade's edge. Ichigo had to admit that, simple as it was, the idea was an exceptionally good one, while Orium had no ability to make the blade denser or sharpen it by drawing out the natural abilities of a cutting implement. She'd found a way around it. And in fact, if Ichigo remembered the cutting power of Orium's lines correctly, this was better on a practical front, since it could not simply be overpowered by a superior Zanjutsu user, but rather would cut through anything. Ichigo smiled and commented, amused. Well, that's a good trick to start from. Thanks. It's not all I can do though. I spoke with Chad the other day, and he helped me figure a way to use full bringing to make the sword move faster. She demonstrated, swinging the sword a couple times back and forth, and Ichigo could see she was letting out her Ryutsu as she did, which reduced the air resistance. She grinned when Ichigo nodded along at that, and said, and look, Mr. Shunsui helped me figure this one out, too, as she pulled out a steel tube from the sack of equipment she'd brought along. Ichigo wondered for a moment both why she had something like that and where she'd found it, but then his attention refocused as Orium visibly called back her fairies from the blade, removing the unstoppable edge from the Zanpakuto, and then swung at the tube, and the Zanpakuto cut through it with incredible ease, as if it was made of paperboard rather than metal, despite Orium lacking the strength to achieve anything even close to that. Of course, he could see that she'd flooded the steel tube with her Ryutsu, but he had to think for a moment to realize she'd used her full bringer abilities to change the properties of her target. Still, it didn't really seem like an ability that'd be much use in an actual fight. That was creative, but I don't know that it'd be much use in an actual fight if you need to hit your opponents with your Ryutsu before your sword can affect them. I know, but Mr. Shunsui figured that as well, and I've thought up a way around that. And she demonstrated, flooding her sword with her Ryutsu, but keeping it there. By paying close attention, Ichigo could see she was holding it connected to herself through the hand holding the sword. Then, as she swung, she let go, and the Ryutsu traveled just a bit further in front of the sword. If the sword slash had been aimed at something, the Ryutsu would have affected the target just as the blade hit it. He could see how that could work. That's way better, yes. However, using it that way sort of defeat the point of fighting with a sword, doesn't it? Orium had looked quite happy at the compliment, but then her face morphed to confusion as Ichigo went on and she asked, looking completely dumbfounded. What do you mean? Well, if you can get your Ryutsu on your opponent, you can damage them with it in so many ways you don't really need to also cut them with the sword, isn't it? Orium puffed her cheek at that and countered, sounding annoyed. That's wrong. Chad said the Ryutsu only affect things, not people. If you're using full bringer, sure, but you could charge the Ryutsu with rage instead, or... Ichigo trailed off, as he realized that, while he would be able to do that, Orium wouldn't, since unlike him, she didn't know Hakuta, and he suspected something that required such a precise emotional control might well be harder for Orium to learn than it had been for him. Ichigo grimaced, then shook his head and said, never mind, I'm sorry. Orium's annoyance left her at those words, and she looked confused instead. You're sorry about what? I just forgot that I know stuff about combat that you don't. Orium grinned at that, and said in a reassuring tone. That's fine, if you didn't you couldn't teach me. That's what friends are for, isn't it? To help you with things you can't do, and be helped by you in things they can't do. Ichigo smiled, when she put it that way, it was hard to argue the point. So, he focused instead on going back to the training, and thinking over what she'd said, he asked, genuinely curious. So, you trained with Chad some, you said? Did he show you something else that would help with your plans of becoming a swordswoman, other than the lessening of air resistance? He did. He's very good at it, he had a lot of ideas I hadn't thought about. And then, for the following 10 minutes, She proceeded to demonstrate a number of techniques that infused the ground and air with Ryotsu, allowing for manipulating an opponent's footing to make them stumble or reinforce her own to be able to put her full strength into a strike, or making the air thicker to slow attacks while making it thinner another point to be able to swing or dodge much faster than normal. Watching Orium go through the motions, it was evident to Ichigo that she didn't really have a lot of skills in actually combining the various tricks in a cohesive fighting style. Instead, she always used the same trick, although Orium called them super moves, when she wanted to accomplish a specific result. Even with that, however, Ichigo could see how well devised the moves were, and he had little doubt that, for an opponent who had no clue about her abilities, she would be difficult to beat, at least until her attack patterns were figured out. That gave Ichigo an idea of how he could help her, but before he could, he needed her to confirm a suspicion he had. Thus he stopped Orium and asked, letting his curiosity show. Orium, when Chad taught you these moves and what to use them for, how much did you help him come up with them? She grinned, clearly pleased at the question, and answered, motioning to the fairies around her. Tsubaki and Shin-O came up with most of the ideas of how a swordswoman should fight in general. Then I explained Chad what I had learned to do when I was training with Nanao, and he gave me tips on how to apply my ideas better, where they could fit with the suggestions from Shun Shunrika, and then gave me suggestions on what super moves to use to fill in the gaps. That was, Ichigo admitted to himself, more involvement than he'd expected Orium to have had, which was good, and made his plan easier. He motioned to her and explained, in a practical tone. That's good, but if you have only one move for everything, a cunning enemy might predict your move and beat you. Orium's eyes widened in surprise at that. Oh. I didn't think of that. That's fine, I can think of ways to help. All you need is to have 2 moves for each situation, rather than 1, that way, you can switch between the 2 to surprise your opponent. Of course, that was far from perfect. While being able to shift her fighting style would help Orium a lot against most opponents, somebody good enough would be able to either figure out the shifting patterns or just breaking through them by sheer skill. Then again, creative surprises were sort of Orium's specialty, so he was confident that, if her base was solid enough, she'd be able to use her natural instincts to pull through. It was one of the most unique things about her and, if Ichigo was being honest with himself, one of the things that made her so fun to have around. She might something make things weird, but she almost never made them boring. Realizing that continuing down that line of thoughts might lead him to distracting thoughts, Ichigo refocused on how best to go about helping Orium. As he thought over the skills she had showed, he realized this wasn't going to be easy, because, while he probably had a better grasp of the mechanism of Fullbring, Orium clearly was far more skilled in its use, and the techniques she had were not ones Ichigo would have been able to come up with himself, probably because Chad had helped, and Ichigo had little doubt his friend had both more skill and a greater understanding of Fullbring than both of them together. Idly, as he was trying to figure out where to go, Ichigo commented, "Chad's really worked hard to figure this power out, didn't he?" To which Orium answered with a nod and saying, "Yeah, he really gets it. I can explain a bit, but maybe you should try asking him for help if you need it, this is all a bit complex," to which Ichigo blinked. It was a good idea, actually. He'd not have had Getsuga if Chad hadn't helped him to figure it out, and Ichigo resolved to seek his friend out to see if he had any more pointers to offer him. Unaware of what he was thinking, Orium grinned and added, "And he said he wanted to ask you about the Shinigami arts to see if you could help him make sense of something he'd noticed, so it'd be good for him as well." "Really? Did he said what it was?" Orium paused, seemingly to think it over, scrunching her brows to recall the specific memory, before smiling as it came to her. "Yeah. It was about that guy you fought, Jin. Chad said he noticed that the man seemed to almost never show any uncontrolled emotions, less like he was hiding them and more like he just didn't feel them. He wanted to ask you if you noticed anything about him that might explain that, since he said you've fought the man more times. I don't know how much that'd help, those fights were pretty short, I didn't really have much time to study his fighting style. Although I did notice a few strange things about him as we fought." "Oh? Like what?" Ichigo frowned, while a lot of details about Jin had left him uncertain. Putting the resulting feeling into words to define it exactly was hard. "It's a number of little things, more than any big one. For example, he was hit straight on by an attack that should have hurt him but didn't. yet a moment later he was hit by a much less deadly attack and showed signs of having been hurt by it, however slightly. Or how quickly he picked up a technique after he saw me demonstrating it just once. And when my Zero hit his sword, it didn't simply punch through like it otherwise does with anything, it seemed to spread to the sword itself for a moment before breaking it. Orium was looking just as confused as he felt, so Ichigo shrugged. It doesn't necessarily means anything. Maybe the sword thing was a weird interaction between his Bankai's ability to cut through anything and Asiro's ability to pass through anything. Maybe when it seemed like the fireball had hit him straight, he'd actually deflected it somehow. And maybe he's just that much better than me in Zanjutsu. That last one was a bit annoying, which was weird because normally Ichigo had no problem acknowledging other people were better than him at something. It was, he decided, about the attitude, and that, he realized, was also what brought the various things that didn't seem to line up properly together. Maybe it's just how he always seems to be in control. Byakuya was just as good, probably better, at pretending to always be on top of things, but when I surprised him, he reacted. With Jin, however, it's like he really is. Even the one time I surprised him with the Zero he was barely surprised, and then acted amused by it all. And unlike Byakuya, it doesn't feel like it's just a matter of his poker face being better, you know. Orium seemed to have been following along, and she chuckled at the question before answering, in a joking tone. I don't know, but maybe, if he's not got a good poker face, then he's just got an ace in the hole. Ichigo blinked before Orium's reference connected for him. He wouldn't have considered it like that, and perhaps Orium's wouldn't have either if he hadn't put things in the manner he had, but now that she'd said it, he could just see it. Jin had a secret, something connected to all the strange things about him. That's why he was always so smug and amused at what was going down around him, why he always looked like he knew something everybody else didn't. Realizing this, Ichigo knew, didn't really change much, or give him any better way to handle the man if he were to face him again. Yet, he couldn't help but still feel happy for having figured it out. After all, the knowledge that a secret existed was the first necessary step to figure out what the secret was, and if he discussed and compared his observations with Chad with that idea in mind, it might just lead to some serious progress. He grinned at Orium, grateful at her for having helped him figure this out, and she grinned back as he said, you know, that might just be it, thank you for the help. Well, you're helping me become a better fighter, is only right that I help you back. That caused Ichigo to chuckle slightly, and then he moved to try and figure out things he could help her with. He started by motioning to her fairies. Could you return to reinforce the sword's edge again? There's a thing I want to check. When they did, he moved behind Orium, covering her eyes with his hands, to which she giggled. He ignored that and instead said, in his best instructor tone. Now, can you strike the tube on the ground without seeing it? With his hands over them, Ichigo could feel Orium's eyes widening in surprise as, after she swung down, the sword cut a new slice off the steel tube. She let out a happy squeal and said I did it. Before frowning and asking, somewhat confused but, how? Ichigo removed his hands from her eyes and moved back to in front of her, before pointing to the two fairies and saying, to them both as well as Orium. Shun Shunrika here did the seeing for you. The fairy named Shin-O piped up at that, in a very proud tone. Of course. We're going to help Orium in any way we can. That's good, great, even. But you need to work with her to make it more than just a way you help her, to turn it into a true feature of her fighting style. He ignored the confused look on the fairies' faces to focus on Orium, who also looked like she didn't get what he was speaking of. Ichigo wasn't worried, however, because he knew she would once he explained it in a way that appealed to her, so he said, as he grabbed the piece of sliced steel tube on the ground. It's all a matter of trust. If you know that your sword is going to be there, you can focus on planning your next move instead. It's like a partnership. Orium's eyes lighted up with understanding, as Ichigo had expected, and he drew Zanjutsu even as he threw the piece of sliced metal behind himself, swinging blindly and then letting the Zanpakuto take over and direct the movement of his arm, causing the blade to strike the steel tube with a resounding clang. Orium clapped her hands, and then said in a happy tone. It's about working together. Of course, Nanao said I had to work together with the sword, but I didn't realize I wasn't doing that with Shun Shunrika, or that they and the sword need to work together too. We can only be friends if we all are part of the same team, isn't it? Ichigo smiled. There was something endearing in seeing Orium so happy at the idea of making her fighting more of a group projects, and she was already discussing with the fairies the many ways they could help each other and her sword. He interrupted before she could get too lost in it and said, in an amused tone, "You also need to think of how to integrate your barriers in your swordsmanship style. You can move the barriers around, right? You direct them with your hands, I think." Orium nodded happily at that. "Yes. It was Tsubaki's idea. We use hand signals like proper ninjas so that the enemy can't know what I'm going to do." "That's good, but you can do better." "We can. You could use body language instead." Seeing that Orium hadn't understood, Ichigo explained, pointing at her left arm. "You can form the barriers wherever you want, right? So, can you form one here, in contact with the forearm and elbow?" She did, but the barrier was far too big, taller than Orium herself, so he directed the fairies to change position as he pointed at various points, then tapping Orium's forearm at certain points to ensure the barrier aligned itself correctly. Once he had formed a triangular one just about the size of her arm, he pointed for her to move her wrist even as he said, addressing the fairies, "Now follow along so you maintain the same alignment with her arm as you have right now." As they did, Orium's eyes widened and she said, sounding excited, "Like this, it's for as if it was a shield, like I'm a knight." Ichigo grinned at the enthusiasm, and then pointed out, "That's right, but it isn't everything you could do. For example, how about you try throwing a punch with that arm, and while you do, can you three-spun so that you on the bottom can line up with Orium's fist?" The fairies followed the direction as Orium punched, and she grinned as she realized that, with the tip of the shield pointed forward, it was like her fist had a small blade from it. "I can stab things by punching them with this." You could also have the three fairies moving so that the shield rotates like a hacksaw. She looked inordinately pleased at that as she swung her arm back and forth, with the shield spinning around her arm the whole time, even making a buzzing sound with her mouth as she did. Ichigo shook his head, then drew her attention by saying with a smile, "And there's other things you might do." "Really? Like what?" "Well, you could attach a shield to your sword to extend its striking range." He directed her fairies to show her what he meant, and when she saw the irregularly shaped triangle with the tip pointing upwards, so that her Zanpakuto had a sort of extra protrusion that made it about 2 times as long, Ichigo could have sworn her eyes were shining. "This is like the thing you do, making your sword go huge. With this I'm just like you, Ichigo." She turned an overeager look on him asking what else? "You have more, right? Let's see, you can stay on a flat barrier to fly, right? What if you made 2 small ones, the size of the shield, and had one under each of your feet?" Orium looked uncertain at that. "If they're that small, wouldn't I risk slipping?" "Not if you use the trick that Chad taught you about increasing the resistance of the air, and apply it to that under your feet. It'd give you more traction so I wouldn't slip, and then I'll be able to walk on air." "That's awesome." Orium was happy enough that she started hopping in place, and Ichigo braced himself as, sure enough, she threw herself at him, her arms hugging him across the chest as she shouted, "You figured out a lot of stuff so quickly, that's so cool," in that overeager manner that was so typical of her. For a moment, Ichigo was very aware of how physically close they were, their bodies pushing into each other, in a way Orium's frequent hugs in the past hadn't. However, despite this it didn't feel as awkward as just being in the room with her had felt at the beginning of the training session, and Ichigo found it almost effortless to push the distracting sensations away and focus on gently disentangling Orium from him without getting cut by her sword, before going back to give her back some more ideas and suggestion on how she could integrate her full-bringer power into swordsmanship. The process turned out to be surprisingly fun, enough so that Ichigo lost himself into it, even as seeing the many ways Orium could combine her powers gave him a few ideas on how he could improve his own abilities. He didn't realize how long the two of them had been going at it, exchanging tips and discussing possibilities, until the sound of the doorbell ringing drew their attention and Ichigo realized the sun had set already. As he opened, Tatsuki looked amused at seeing him. "Still here? We sort of got lost in training." Their friend nodded, letting herself in, commenting, "It might be better that way, saves me a trip." "What do you mean?" Tatsuki showed a folded piece of paper, and explained. Master Hiri sent her answer, She says she'll be willing to talk with the representatives of the Godiai in a week, as long as it's no more than 4 Shinigami, none of which are captains, and 2 of the 4 are Ikeku Madarame and Yumi Chika Yasukawa. Ichigo smiled, clapping Tatsuki on the shoulder. That's good, isn't it? We've got the meeting we wanted, and it was because you planned it correctly. Tatsuki, however, looked troubled. Maybe, but I don't know, I worry that it might all blow up regardless. Not much we can do about that other than try our best. Tatsuki nodded, but didn't look persuaded. However, even as he said goodbye to his friends and left, Ichigo felt that she worried too much. While the situation was complicated, he was starting to feel that, if they just put all their effort into making it works, things might just work out after all. Check the description for the links to the author.